Addiction. Why you can't stop. Hello, beautiful dreamers, and welcome back to Science for Sleep. I'm here with you tonight, ready to take you on another gentle journey through the corridors of human discovery. Tonight, we're going to explore one of humanity's most profound and persistent mysteries, a story that touches every culture, every generation, and perhaps every family. It's the story of addiction. But this isn't a clinical tale or a cautionary story. Tonight, we're going to drift together through the soft, contemplative history of how humans have tried to understand why we sometimes can't stop doing things that hurt us. We'll walk through ancient temples where the first questions were whispered, through medieval monasteries where monks pondered the nature of desire, and into modern laboratories where scientists illuminate the gentle chemistry of our yearning hearts. So settle in, dear listener. Pull your blankets close, dim the lights, and let your breathing slow. Tonight's journey is one of compassion, understanding, and the beautiful, endless human quest to comprehend ourselves. Close your eyes, and let's begin. The first questions. The ancient whispers of understanding. Imagine, if you will, a warm evening in ancient Mesopotamia, somewhere around 4000 BCE. The sun is setting over the Fertile Crescent, painting the sky in gentle oranges and purples. In a small clay house, a woman sits by the flickering light of an oil lamp, her hands trembling slightly as she reaches for a ceramic vessel containing fermented barley. She knows she shouldn't. She's promised herself countless times. Yet here she is again, drawn by an invisible thread she cannot see, cannot cut, cannot understand. This woman, whose name is lost to history, was perhaps among the first humans to ask the question that would echo through millennia: why can't I stop? The story of addiction begins not with medicine or science, but with this simple, heartbreaking human experience. Long before we had words like dopamine or neural pathways, humans were grappling with the mysterious pull of substances and behaviors that both soothed and destroyed. In these earliest civilizations, the line between medicine, spirituality, and what we now call addiction was beautifully blurred. The Sumerians had a saying written in cuneiform on tablets that archaeologists still discover buried in the sand: "The plant that brings joy also brings sorrow." They understood even then that the very things that lifted us up could also cast us down. Ancient Egyptian papyri describe workers along the Nile who would consume too much of the fermented bread they called zetum. The scribes wrote with a kind of poetic sadness about how these workers would promise their families they would stop, yet return again and again to the same taverns by the river. The Egyptians didn't have our modern understanding of brain chemistry, but they recognized patterns. They saw that some people seemed more vulnerable than others, that times of stress made the pull stronger, that community and purpose could sometimes break the cycle. In the gentle hills of ancient Persia, Zoroastrian priests wrote about the eternal struggle between light and darkness, not just in the world, but within each human soul. They believed that addiction was a manifestation of this cosmic battle, that when we repeatedly chose something that harmed us, we were experiencing the fundamental tension of existence itself. There's something deeply moving about this early understanding. They didn't see addiction as a moral failing, but as a reflection of the universe's own struggle between creation and destruction. The ancient Greeks, those beautiful thinkers who gave us philosophy itself, were equally fascinated by this phenomenon. Aristotle, walking through the olive groves of Athens, spoke of akrasia, the concept of acting against one's better judgment. He observed that humans could know something was harmful and still be drawn to it like a moth to flame. This wasn't ignorance. This was something deeper, something that challenged the very notion that knowledge alone could guide behavior. Plato, in his gentle way, compared the human soul to a charioteer trying to control two horses, one noble and one wild. The wild horse, he suggested, was always pulling toward immediate pleasure, while the charioteer, reason, struggled to guide both horses toward what was truly good. When the wild horse became too strong, when desire overwhelmed reason, that's when humans found themselves trapped in patterns they couldn't break. But perhaps the most touching early understanding comes from ancient China, where Taoist philosophers observed the natural world with extraordinary patience. They noticed that a river, over time, could carve even the hardest stone, not through force, but through gentle, persistent repetition. They began to see addiction in similar terms, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a gradual wearing away of the soul's natural defenses. The Tao Te Ching speaks of this with characteristic gentleness. The soft overcomes the hard. The gentle overcomes the rigid. Chinese physicians of the Han Dynasty kept detailed records of what they called qi disorders, imbalances in the body's natural energy that led to compulsive behaviors. They noticed that these disorders often ran in families, that they were worse during certain seasons, and that they seemed connected to both physical constitution and life circumstances. Without knowing about genetics or neurotransmitters, they were documenting the complex interplay of factors that we now know contribute to addiction. In ancient India, Buddhist monks developed perhaps the most sophisticated early psychology of desire and attachment. Sitting in meditation for hours, days, years, they observed their own minds with scientific precision. They cataloged the arising of craving, the way it grew and demanded satisfaction, the temporary relief that came with indulgence, and the inevitable return of wanting. The Buddha's Four Noble Truths begin with the recognition that suffering comes from attachment, that we suffer not because we desire things, but because we can't let go of our desires. Buddhist texts from this period are filled with remarkably modern insights. They describe how craving creates neural pathways, though they called them mental formations, how these pathways become stronger with repetition, and how liberation comes not from fulfilling desires, but from understanding their impermanent nature. Monks would spend months observing a single craving, for food, for comfort, for approval, watching how it arose, peaked, and passed away like clouds across the sky. The Ayurvedic tradition in India developed an equally nuanced understanding. They recognized that different people had different constitutions. Some were naturally more prone to attachment, others to aversion, others to confusion. They developed treatments that combined herbs, meditation, yoga, and community support. Most beautifully, they understood that healing addiction required treating not just the individual, but their relationships, their environment, and their sense of purpose. As we drift through these ancient understandings, we begin to see something remarkable. Despite not having our modern scientific tools, early humans developed profound insights into the nature of addiction. They recognized its universality, its complexity, and its deep connection to the human condition itself. They didn't see it as a disease to be cured or a crime to be punished, but as a fundamental aspect of what it means to be human, flawed, yearning, struggling to balance immediate desires with long-term well-being. Indigenous traditions around the world developed their own beautiful frameworks for understanding these struggles. Native American tribes spoke of being out of balance, recognizing that harmful patterns arose when people lost connection to community, to nature, to their spiritual purpose. Their healing ceremonies focused not on eliminating desire, but on restoring harmony, bringing the person back into right relationship with themselves and their world. In the Amazon rainforest, shamans understood that some plants could both heal and harm, that the difference lay not in the substance, but in the relationship. They developed elaborate protocols for using plant medicine safely, always within the context of ceremony, community, and spiritual guidance. Their wisdom recognized what modern science is only now rediscovering, that set and setting, the mindset of the person and the environment of use, are crucial factors in determining whether a substance becomes medicine or poison. Aboriginal Australians had perhaps the most integrated understanding of all. They saw addiction not as an individual problem, but as a symptom of disconnection from country, from dream time, from the intricate web of relationships that gave life meaning. Their healing approach involved not just the person struggling with addiction, but their entire extended family and community. Healing meant restoring connection to land, to ancestors, to purpose, to the sacred stories that gave life direction and meaning. As the first chapter of our journey comes to a close, we find ourselves surrounded by the wisdom of our ancestors. They may not have understood brain chemistry, but they understood human hearts. They may not have had MRI machines, but they had thousands of years of careful observation. They saw that addiction was about more than just substances. It was about connection, meaning, balance, and the eternal human struggle to find peace in an uncertain world. These ancient voices whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that the question, "Why can't I stop?" is not new. It's a question humans have been asking since we first discovered that some things could make us feel better temporarily, while making our lives worse permanently. And in their attempts to answer, our ancestors laid the foundation for everything we understand today. As we prepare to move forward in our story, carry with you this ancient wisdom. Addiction is not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It's a deeply human response to pain, disconnection, and the search for something more. Our ancestors knew this, felt this, and developed remarkably sophisticated ways of understanding and healing these ancient wounds. Sleep now, with the gentle knowledge that humans have always struggled with these patterns, and humans have always found ways to help each other heal. Tomorrow's chapter will take us deeper into this story, but for now, rest in the comfort of knowing you are not alone in these struggles. You are part of an ancient human story of seeking, struggling, and ultimately, understanding. The medieval heart, monasteries, manuscripts, and the soul's longing. As morning light filters through the stained glass windows of a 12th century monastery in the rolling hills of France, we find Brother Thomas bent over a manuscript, his quill trembling slightly as he writes. The parchment before him bears the title De Spiritu et Anima, on the spirit and soul. He pauses, touching his temple, where a familiar throbbing reminds him of his own struggles with what the brothers call the wine that comforts and condemns. The medieval period brought a profound shift in how humans understood addiction, though they wouldn't use that word for many centuries yet. In the quiet corridors of monasteries, churches, and early universities, brilliant minds began to develop frameworks that would influence our understanding for 1,000 years. Thomas Aquinas, the gentle giant of medieval philosophy, spent countless hours contemplating what he called concupiscence, the tendency of humans to desire things that weren't good for them. Writing by candlelight in his study in Paris, Aquinas developed a surprisingly modern understanding of what we now call addiction. He recognized that these struggles weren't simply matters of weak will, but involved what he called disordered appetites, natural human drives that had somehow become misdirected. Aquinas observed that humans seemed to have different vulnerabilities. Some struggled with food, others with wine, others with gambling or sexual desire, but the pattern was always the same. A person would know something was harmful, genuinely want to stop, yet find themselves unable to resist when the moment of temptation arrived. This contradiction fascinated him. How could someone simultaneously want and not want the same thing? His answer was beautiful in its complexity. Aquinas proposed that humans operate on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the level of pure reason, where we can clearly see what's good for us. There's the level of emotion and desire, where we feel pulled toward immediate pleasure or relief. And there's the level of will, which attempts to coordinate between these often conflicting impulses. Addiction, he suggested, occurred when reason and will became overwhelmed by the power of disordered appetite. But Aquinas went further. He recognized that these struggles were often rooted in deeper wounds. A person might drink excessively not just because they enjoyed wine, but because they were trying to numb grief, loneliness, or despair. This insight, that addiction is often a maladaptive attempt to solve an emotional problem, wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology for another 700 years. In the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, monks copied and preserved texts from the Islamic Golden Age, where physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina or Avicenna had developed sophisticated understandings of what they called diseases of the soul. These Islamic scholars, working in the libraries of Baghdad and Cordoba, had observed patterns that we now recognize as clear descriptions of addiction. Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhasis, wrote extensively about what he called pathological desires. Working in a hospital in Baghdad in the 8th century, he noticed that some patients seemed unable to control their consumption of opium even when it was clearly harming their health. But rather than attributing this to moral weakness, Al-Razi developed a medical model. He observed that these patients often had histories of physical pain, emotional trauma, or what he called melancholic temperaments. His treatment approach was remarkably holistic. Al-Razi prescribed not just medical interventions, but also music therapy, social support, and what he called exercises in contemplation, early forms of mindfulness practice. He understood that healing these conditions required not just addressing the immediate behavior, but the underlying suffering that drove it. Ibn Sina, writing in his magnificent Canon of Medicine, went even further. He proposed that what we now call addiction involved a corruption of the body's natural regulatory systems. He observed that people who consumed opium regularly seemed to need increasing amounts to achieve the same effect and experienced physical illness when they stopped. This was perhaps the first medical description of tolerance and withdrawal, concepts that wouldn't be fully understood for another 1,000 years. The medieval Islamic world also gave us some of the first systematic studies of what we might now call addiction treatment. Hospitals in Damascus and Cairo kept detailed records of patients struggling with opium dependence. They noted that successful treatment required not just medical intervention, but also social support, spiritual guidance, and gradual reduction rather than sudden cessation. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, a different but equally profound understanding was developing within Christian mysticism. Desert fathers and mothers, living in caves and simple cells, developed sophisticated maps of what they called the passions, emotional and behavioral patterns that could trap the soul. They identified what they called the 8 passionate thoughts, including what we might now recognize as addictive patterns around food, sex, and material possessions. But the medieval Christians brought something new to the understanding of addiction, the concept of grace. They recognized that willpower alone was often insufficient to break these patterns. Liberation, they believed, required something beyond human effort, a kind of divine intervention that could transform the heart itself. This insight, stripped of its theological language, contains a profound psychological truth. Recovery from addiction often requires resources beyond individual willpower. St. Augustine, writing his Confessions in the 4th century, but widely studied throughout the medieval period, provided perhaps the most beautiful early description of addictive struggle. His account of his sexual compulsions reads like a modern psychological case study. I was held bound not by an iron chain imposed by someone else,
but by the iron of my own will. The enemy had my will in his power, and from it he had made a chain and bound me.
Augustine's insight was revolutionary. Addiction involved a kind of bondage of the will itself. It wasn't that addicted people chose harmful behaviors, it was that their capacity to choose had become compromised. This understanding would later influence everything from medieval medicine to modern neuroscience. The medieval period also saw the development of what might be considered the first addiction treatment centers. Monasteries throughout Europe began accepting what they called penitents, people struggling with compulsive behaviors who sought refuge and healing within religious communities. These early treatment approaches combined physical care, spiritual guidance, meaningful work, and social support, a holistic model that modern addiction treatment is only now rediscovering. The Benedictine monasteries were particularly sophisticated in their approach. They understood that healing required structure, but also compassion. They developed daily routines that included prayer, work, study, and community meals, activities that we now know help regulate the brain's reward systems and build new neural pathways. They also practiced what they called particular friendships, mentoring relationships where experienced monks guided newcomers through their struggles. But perhaps most importantly, the medieval monasteries understood that recovery required a complete transformation of life purpose. They didn't just try to help people stop harmful behaviors. They helped them discover new sources of meaning, connection, and transcendence. This insight, that addiction often fills a spiritual vacuum that must be replaced with genuine purpose, remains one of the most important principles of effective treatment. Medieval Islamic scholars working in a different religious tradition developed parallel insights. Sufi mystics like Al-Ghazali wrote extensively about what they called diseases of the heart, patterns of attachment and craving that separated humans from divine love. Their treatment approaches involved not just individual spiritual practice, but also community rituals, artistic expression, and service to others. The Sufi tradition understood that craving was often misdirected spiritual hunger. They observed that people who seemed addicted to worldly pleasures were often at a deeper level seeking transcendence, connection, and meaning. Their approach to healing involved redirecting this spiritual energy toward healthier outlets: music, poetry, dance, service, and mystical contemplation. In medieval Jewish communities, scholars and physicians developed their own sophisticated understanding of compulsive behaviors. The Talmudic tradition included extensive discussions of what they called Yetzer Hara, the inclination to harmful behavior that seemed to exist within every human heart. But rather than seeing this as something to be eliminated, Jewish scholars understood it as a necessary aspect of human nature that needed to be channeled and transformed. Maimonides, the great 12th century philosopher and physician, wrote extensively about what he called diseases of the soul. Working in Cordoba and later in Egypt, he observed patients who seemed unable to control their consumption of various substances and behaviors. His treatment approach was remarkably modern. He emphasized the importance of gradual change, social support, and addressing underlying emotional wounds. As the medieval period progressed, universities began to emerge across Europe, and with them came the first systematic attempts to understand human behavior through what they called natural philosophy, the precursor to modern psychology. Scholars at the University of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna began to develop theories about human motivation that would later influence our understanding of addiction. These early psychologists, working within the framework of medieval Christianity, recognized that humans seemed to operate according to different types of love. There was caritas, selfless love directed toward God and others,
And there was cupiditas, selfish love directed toward temporal pleasures. They observed that when cupiditas became too strong, it could create what they called spiritual blindness, where a person could no longer see clearly what was truly good for them. This medieval understanding of addiction as disordered love is remarkably sophisticated. They recognized that addiction behaviors weren't random or meaningless. They were misguided attempts to fulfill genuine human needs for pleasure, comfort, connection, and transcendence. The solution wasn't to eliminate these needs, but to redirect them toward healthier objects. Medieval physicians also began to recognize the physical dimensions of addictive behaviors. They observed that people who consumed too much wine or opium often developed what they called corrupted humors, imbalances in the body's natural chemistry that made craving stronger and self-control weaker. While their understanding of physiology was limited, they were documenting real biological processes. The medieval period also gave us some of the first addiction memoirs, personal accounts of struggle and recovery written by individuals who had experienced these patterns themselves. These texts, often written by reformed monks or converted nobles, provide intimate glimpses into the subjective experience of addiction. They describe the shame, the isolation, the desperate attempts to stop, and the slow process of healing with extraordinary honesty and insight.
One such account, written by a 13th century monk known only as Brother Francis, describes his struggle with what he calls the demon of wine. His description of craving is startlingly modern. It begins as a whisper, so soft I can scarce hear it. But the whisper grows to a voice, the voice to a shout, the shout to a roar that drowns out all other thoughts. And when the roar becomes unbearable, I find myself walking to the cellar as if in a dream, my feet moving without my will's permission. Brother Francis's account also describes what we now recognize as withdrawal. When I attempted to refuse the wine entirely, my body rebelled. My hands shook like leaves in a storm, my stomach churned like a tempested sea, and such darkness descended upon my spirit that I feared I might never see light again. But most importantly, his memoir describes the slow process of recovery through community support, spiritual practice, and the gradual development of new sources of meaning and joy. The medieval period's understanding of addiction was shaped by its fundamental recognition of human interconnectedness. Unlike our modern tendency to see addiction as an individual problem requiring individual solutions, medieval thinkers understood that these struggles arose from and could only be healed within the context of community. Monasteries, guilds, and extended family networks all played crucial roles in supporting recovery. Medieval guilds, associations of craftsmen and merchants, developed some of the earliest workplace policies around what we might now call substance abuse. They recognized that excessive drinking could impair craftsmanship and endanger fellow workers. But their approach was rehabilitative rather than punitive. Guild members who struggled with drinking were assigned mentors, given easier tasks during recovery, and gradually reintegrated into full participation as they healed. The medieval period's understanding of time also influenced their approach to addiction recovery. Medieval people had a cyclical understanding of time, shaped by the seasons, the agricultural calendar, and the liturgical year. They understood that healing was not a linear process, but involved cycles of progress and setback, growth and dormancy, struggle and rest. This patience with the nonlinear nature of recovery is something modern treatment is only beginning to appreciate. Medieval medicine also recognized what we now call co-occurring conditions. Physicians observed that people struggling with compulsive behaviors often also suffered from what they called melancholia, depression, mania, what we might now call bipolar disorder, and anxietas, anxiety. They understood that these conditions were interconnected and required comprehensive treatment.
The medieval Islamic world developed particularly sophisticated approaches to what we might now call dual diagnosis treatment. Hospitals in Baghdad and Damascus had specialized wards for patients with multiple conditions, and physicians developed treatment protocols that addressed both the compulsive behaviors and underlying emotional conditions. As the medieval period drew to a close, European society was beginning to change in ways that would profoundly influence how addiction was understood and treated. The rise of cities, the development of international trade, and the gradual secularization of medicine would all play crucial roles in shaping modern approaches to addiction. But the medieval contribution to our understanding of addiction cannot be overstated. This period gave us the recognition that addiction involves the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. It gave us the understanding that recovery requires community support and spiritual transformation, and it gave us the insight that addiction often represents misdirected spiritual hunger that can only be healed by finding authentic sources of meaning and transcendence. As you drift toward sleep tonight, carry with you the gentle wisdom of these medieval voices. They remind us that addiction is not a modern problem, but an ancient human struggle. They show us that our ancestors faced these same challenges and found ways to heal, support each other, and transform their lives. In their libraries and monasteries, in their hospitals and healing centers, they developed insights that remain relevant today. That addiction is about more than just substances, that recovery requires community, and that healing is always possible when we approach it with wisdom, patience, and compassion.
The medieval understanding of addiction as disordered love offers us a particularly beautiful framework for healing. Instead of seeing addictive behaviors as evidence of moral failure, we can see them as evidence of the human capacity for love itself. Love that has become misdirected but can, with patience and support, be guided toward healthier expressions. Rest now in the gentle understanding that humans have always struggled with these patterns, and humans have always found ways to heal. The medieval voices whisper across the centuries, "You are not broken, you are not alone, and healing is always possible." In tomorrow's chapter, we'll explore how the Renaissance brought new questions and new answers to this ancient human struggle. Renaissance Revelations, when art and science begin to dance. The year is 1453, and Constantinople has just fallen to the Ottoman Empire. Scholars flee westward, carrying with them precious manuscripts that have been preserved in libraries for centuries. Among these texts are works by ancient Greek and Islamic physicians that will revolutionize European understanding of human behavior, including the mysterious patterns we're now beginning to call addiction. Picture Leonardo da Vinci in his workshop in Milan, surrounded by sketches of human anatomy, mechanical inventions, and observations of the natural world. In one corner of his studio sits a series of drawings that few historians discuss, detailed studies of what he calls the gestures of compulsion. Leonardo has been observing people in taverns, at gambling tables, and in other situations where humans seem driven by forces beyond their conscious control. With his characteristic scientific curiosity, Leonardo documents the physical manifestations of craving. The way hands shake before reaching for wine, the particular tension that appears around the eyes of gamblers, the restless movements of people in withdrawal. He's beginning to see addiction not as a moral or spiritual failing, but as a pattern that can be observed, measured, and understood through the same empirical methods he uses to study bird flight or water flow. Leonardo's notebooks contain some of the first anatomical speculations about addiction. He theorizes that these patterns might be related to what he calls the body's hidden channels, the nervous system that he's only beginning to understand. His drawings show the brain connected to the heart through intricate networks of what he calls spiritual pathways.
While his physiology is still largely speculative, his intuition that addiction involves complex interactions between mind and body is remarkably prescient. The Renaissance brought with it a fundamental shift in how humans understood themselves and their place in the universe. The rediscovery of classical texts, combined with new empirical methods of investigation, created an intellectual revolution that would transform every field of human knowledge, including our understanding of addiction. Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and alchemist, working in the early 16th century, developed one of the first truly medical approaches to addiction. Born Theophrastus von Hohenheim, he adopted the name Paracelsus, meaning beyond Celsus, the ancient Roman physician, to signal his intention to surpass classical medical understanding. Paracelsus spent years traveling through Europe, studying folk healing traditions and observing patterns of human behavior. He became particularly interested in what he called diseases of the will, conditions where patients seemed unable to control their own actions despite clearly understanding the harmful consequences. Working in his laboratory in Basel, surrounded by alchemical apparatus and herbal preparations, Paracelsus developed the revolutionary theory that these conditions were genuine medical disorders rather than moral failings. "The dose makes the poison," Paracelsus famously wrote, and this insight proved crucial for understanding addiction. He observed that many substances could be either healing medicines or dangerous poisons, depending entirely on the amount consumed and the condition of the patient. This led him to develop some of the first scientific approaches to what we now call harm reduction, using controlled amounts of substances to gradually wean patients from harmful patterns of use. Paracelsus also recognized what modern medicine calls individual variation in drug response. He noticed that some people seemed naturally more susceptible to developing compulsive patterns around certain substances, while others could use the same substances without apparent harm. This observation led him to develop personalized treatment approaches, something modern addiction medicine is only now beginning to implement systematically. Working alongside Paracelsus was a remarkable woman whose story has largely been forgotten by history. Hildegard of Bingen, though she lived in the 12th century, remained influential throughout the Renaissance period. This Benedictine abbess developed perhaps the most sophisticated holistic understanding of addiction in medieval Europe.
Hildegard understood what she called the ecology of the soul, the recognition that human well-being depended on the health of multiple interconnected systems. In her beautiful illuminated manuscripts, she drew intricate diagrams showing how physical health, emotional balance, spiritual connection, and social relationships all influenced each other. Addiction, in her understanding, was what happened when this delicate ecology became disrupted. Hildegard's treatment approaches were correspondingly holistic. She prescribed specific combinations of herbs, music, prayer, artistic expression, and community rituals. Her remedies addressed not just the immediate symptoms of compulsive behavior, but the underlying imbalances that made people vulnerable to these patterns in the first place. The Renaissance also brought increased global trade, and with it, exposure to new substances and new forms of addiction. European explorers returning from the Americas brought tobacco, chocolate, and various plant medicines that would profoundly influence European understanding of altered consciousness and dependency. The introduction of tobacco to Europe in the 16th century created what might be considered the first global addiction epidemic. Within decades of its introduction, physicians and social commentators were noting the powerful hold this new substance seemed to have on those who used it. King James I of England wrote what might be considered the first anti-smoking treatise, A Counterblast to Tobacco, in 1604, describing tobacco as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. But even critics like King James recognized that prohibition alone was ineffective. People continued to use tobacco despite legal penalties, social disapproval, and clear evidence of health harm. This led Renaissance thinkers to begin developing more sophisticated theories about why humans engage in self-destructive behaviors even when they clearly understand the risks. The humanist philosophers of the Renaissance brought a new emphasis on individual psychology to the understanding of addiction. Thinkers like Montaigne, writing in his Tower Library in southwestern France, began to explore the complex inner landscape of human motivation with unprecedented honesty and nuance. Montaigne's essays contain some of the most insightful early psychological observations about addictive behavior. He writes about his own struggles with various compulsions, his inability to moderate his consumption of rich foods, his compulsive need for intellectual stimulation, his patterns of sexual behavior that he recognized as potentially harmful. But rather than approaching these struggles with shame or condemnation, Montaigne brings to them a spirit of scientific curiosity. "We are all patchwork," Montaigne writes, "and so shapeless and diverse in composition that each bit, each moment, plays its own game." This insight that human behavior is complex, contradictory, and constantly changing provided a more nuanced foundation for understanding addiction than the simple moral categories that had previously dominated. Montaigne also recognized what modern psychology calls the false self phenomenon in addiction. He observed that people in the grip of compulsive behaviors often seem to be playing roles rather than expressing their authentic selves. "We are not what we do, but what we do repeatedly becomes who we are." This paradox, that addiction both expresses and distorts authentic selfhood, would become central to later psychological understanding. The Renaissance period also saw the emergence of what we might consider the first addiction literature. Writers like Rabelais, with his tales of Gargantua and Pantagruel, began to explore the comic and tragic dimensions of human excess. These literary works provided new languages for discussing addiction, ways of talking about these struggles that were neither purely medical nor purely moral, but richly human. Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, written in the 1590s, can be read as one of the first literary explorations of what we now recognize as behavioral addiction. Faustus's compulsive pursuit of knowledge and power, despite clearly understanding the destructive consequences, mirrors the patterns that characterize many forms of addiction. Marlowe's insight that addiction involves a kind of spiritual bargain, trading long-term well-being for immediate gratification, remains psychologically acute. The Renaissance period also brought new attention to what we might now call process addictions, compulsive behaviors that don't involve substances but follow similar patterns. Renaissance bankers began to observe and document what they called the gambling madness, patterns of compulsive betting that could destroy entire family fortunes. They noted that this condition seemed to affect people from all social classes and that it often co-occurred with excessive drinking. Italian Renaissance city-states developed some of the first systematic approaches to treating gambling addiction. In Venice and Florence, merchant families created what they called intervention councils, groups of family members and friends who would collectively intervene when someone's gambling threatened their well-being. These early interventions combined financial controls, social support, and what we might now call cognitive behavioral strategies. The Renaissance period also saw significant advances in understanding the relationship between trauma and addiction. Physicians working with soldiers, returning from the constant wars of this period, began to notice patterns. Men who had experienced severe combat trauma were much more likely to develop problems with alcohol or opium. This observation led to some of the first theories about self-medication, the idea that addiction often represents an attempt to treat underlying psychological wounds.
Andreas Vesalius, the great Renaissance anatomist, made discoveries about the nervous system that would eventually prove crucial for understanding addiction. Working with cadavers in Padua, Vesalius mapped the brain and nervous system with unprecedented accuracy. His drawings of what he called the pathways of sensation showed how pleasure and pain signals traveled from the body to the brain, insights that wouldn't be fully understood until the 20th century. Vesalius also made the crucial observation that the brain seemed to change in response to repeated experiences. He noticed that the brains of people who had died from what appeared to be excessive drinking or opium use showed distinctive patterns of damage. While he couldn't explain these changes, he was documenting what we now understand as the neuroplastic changes associated with chronic substance use. The Renaissance brought not just scientific advances, but also artistic ones that influenced how addiction was understood and discussed. Painters like Hieronymus Bosch created haunting images of human excess and compulsion. Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights can be read as a visual exploration of how human desires, initially innocent and natural, can become distorted and destructive when taken to extremes. These artistic representations helped create new cultural languages for discussing addiction. Rather than relying solely on medical or religious terminology, Renaissance culture developed rich metaphorical and symbolic ways of exploring these experiences. This artistic dimension added emotional depth and cultural resonance to the growing scientific understanding. The printing press, invented during this period, revolutionized how knowledge about addiction could be shared and preserved. For the first time in human history, detailed observations and treatment approaches could be widely distributed rather than remaining locked in individual manuscripts. This acceleration of knowledge sharing would prove crucial for the development of addiction medicine. Books about what we now call addiction began to appear throughout Europe. These early texts combined medical observation, philosophical reflection, and practical advice in ways that made sophisticated understanding accessible to ordinary people. They also created communities of readers who shared similar struggles, the beginning of what would eventually become peer support movements. The Renaissance also brought increased attention to the social dimensions of addiction. Humanist philosophers began to recognize that these patterns were influenced not just by individual psychology or physiology, but by social conditions. They observed that addiction was more common in certain environments: overcrowded cities, areas of economic uncertainty, communities disrupted by war or displacement. This social awareness led to some of the first policy approaches to addiction that went beyond individual treatment. Renaissance city-states began to experiment with different approaches to regulating alcohol and other substances, not just through prohibition, but through what we might now call harm reduction policies. They established licensed taverns with regulated hours, created guilds for wine merchants that enforced quality standards, and developed early forms of what we now call addiction counseling. The Venetian Republic, for instance, recognized that completely banning alcohol was both impractical and counterproductive. Instead, they created a sophisticated system of regulation that aimed to minimize harm while acknowledging human nature. They established wine houses where people could drink in safe, supervised environments, hired what they called counselors of temperance to work with people struggling with excessive drinking, and created alternative social venues where people could gather without alcohol being the central focus. These Renaissance policies were remarkable for their pragmatic humanism. Rather than approaching addiction through moral condemnation or pure medical intervention, they tried to create social conditions that made healthy choices easier and harmful patterns less likely. They understood that individual behavior was shaped by environmental factors and tried to engineer environments that supported human well-being. The Renaissance also brought us some of the first systematic studies of what we now call addiction recovery. Physicians in Italy and France began keeping detailed records of patients who had successfully overcome compulsive behaviors, trying to identify common factors in their recovery. These early outcome studies revealed patterns that remain relevant today: the importance of social support, the need for new sources of meaning and purpose, the value of gradual rather than sudden change, and the crucial role of treating underlying emotional wounds.
One particularly beautiful Renaissance development was the emergence of what historians call healing academies. Informal networks of scholars, physicians, artists, and recovered individuals who shared knowledge and support around understanding and overcoming addiction. These academies met in private homes, monastery gardens, and university halls throughout Europe,
creating the first scientific communities dedicated to addiction research and treatment. The Academy of Florence, supported by the Medici family, included among its members physicians who had studied Islamic medical texts, philosophers who explored the nature of human motivation, artists who depicted the struggles and triumphs of recovery, and individuals who shared their own experiences with various forms of compulsive behavior. This interdisciplinary approach created insights that were richer and more practical than any single perspective could provide. As the Renaissance period draws to a close in our gentle bedtime journey, we see how this era laid crucial foundations for modern addiction understanding. Renaissance thinkers gave us empirical observation, individual psychological insight, social awareness, and artistic expression as tools for comprehending these ancient human struggles. They began to see addiction not as a simple moral failure, but as a complex phenomenon requiring sophisticated understanding and compassionate response. The Renaissance also gave us something equally important: hope. For the first time in European history, there was a widespread belief that human nature could be studied, understood, and potentially transformed through knowledge and effort. This optimism about human potential for change would become a cornerstone of all future addiction treatment approaches. As you settle into sleep, imagine yourself in a Renaissance garden at twilight, surrounded by scholars and healers who see your struggles not with judgment, but with compassion and curiosity. They recognize that your patterns of craving and compulsion are part of the beautiful, complex tapestry of human nature. Not flaws to be eliminated, but aspects of yourself to be understood, accepted, and gently transformed. The Renaissance whispers to us across the centuries: you're worthy of scientific curiosity, artistic celebration, and philosophical contemplation. Your struggles are not evidence of failure, but opportunities for deeper understanding of what it means to be gloriously complicated human. Rest in this Renaissance spirit of curiosity, compassion, and hope for transformation. The Age of Enlightenment, Reason, Compassion, and the Birth of Modern Understanding. Dawn breaks over Edinburgh in 1776, and the brilliant Scottish physician Benjamin Rush is walking through the wards of Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital in America. In his gentle hands, he carries a leather-bound journal, where he's been documenting something unprecedented: systematic observations of what he calls the disease of inebriety. Dr. Rush is about to change forever how humanity understands addiction. Picture this revolutionary moment. For the first time in human history, someone is proposing that chronic drunkenness isn't a moral failing or spiritual weakness, but a genuine medical condition. Rush observes that his patients with drinking problems show consistent patterns: loss of control over consumption, continued use despite harmful consequences, and what appears to be genuine physical dependence. Most importantly, he notices that willpower alone rarely produces lasting recovery. Writing by lamplight in his study, Rush pens words that will echo through centuries. I consider drunkenness to be a disease produced by a remote cause and giving birth to actions and uneasiness that have the appearance of other diseases. This simple sentence represents a paradigm shift as significant as any in medical history. Rush is proposing that addiction is not a choice, but a condition, something that happens to people, rather than something they deliberately do. Rush's insights emerged from careful, compassionate observation. He spent hours talking with his patients, listening to their stories, documenting their struggles. What he heard was remarkably consistent. People describing a progressive loss of control, an increasing preoccupation with drinking, and desperate, repeated attempts to stop that inevitably failed. They spoke of shame, isolation, and a sense of being trapped by forces beyond their understanding. But Dr. Rush also observed something else: recovery was possible.
Some of his patients did get better, and when they did, it usually involved several common elements. They typically needed medical support during the initial period of stopping drinking. They required new social connections that didn't revolve around alcohol. They needed meaningful activities to fill the time previously spent drinking. And they often described a kind of spiritual or psychological transformation, a fundamental change in how they understood themselves and their relationship to the world. Dr. Rush's treatment approach was revolutionary for its compassion and complexity. Rather than simply telling patients to stop drinking, he developed comprehensive programs that addressed what he saw as the multiple dimensions of the disease. His patients received medical care for withdrawal symptoms, counseling for underlying emotional issues, support in finding new social connections, and guidance in developing new life purposes. The Age of Enlightenment brought with it a fundamental belief in human reason and the possibility of progress through knowledge. This optimistic worldview profoundly influenced how addiction came to be understood. Enlightenment thinkers believed that human behavior could be studied scientifically, that social conditions could be improved through rational policy, and that individual suffering could be reduced through better understanding and more humane treatment.
Voltaire, writing in his comfortable study at Ferney, developed a social theory of addiction that was centuries ahead of its time. Through his extensive correspondence with physicians, philosophers, and social observers throughout Europe, Voltaire began to recognize that patterns of compulsive behavior were strongly influenced by social conditions. He observed that addiction was more common among the poor, the displaced, and those without meaningful work or social connection. Man is born free, Voltaire might have written, echoing his contemporary Rousseau, but everywhere he is in chains, some forged by tyrants, others by his own repeated choices. Voltaire understood that while individual psychology played a role in addiction, social conditions created the context in which these individual vulnerabilities either flourished or remained dormant. Voltaire's insights led him to advocate for social reforms that would address what he saw as the root causes of addiction: poverty, lack of education, social isolation, and political oppression. He argued that a society that wanted to reduce addiction needed to create conditions where people could find meaning, purpose, and connection through healthy means, rather than being driven to seek relief through harmful substances or behaviors. Meanwhile, in England, the economist Adam Smith was developing insights about human motivation that would prove crucial for understanding addiction. Smith, famous for The Wealth of Nations, also wrote extensively about human psychology in his lesser-known work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Smith's observations about how humans make decisions provided new frameworks for understanding why people sometimes act against their own long-term interests. Smith recognized that humans operate with what he called bounded rationality. We make decisions based on limited information, emotional states, and social pressures rather than pure rational calculation. This insight helped explain why people might choose immediate gratification over long-term well-being, even when they intellectually understood the likely consequences. Smith also developed early insights about what modern psychology calls social learning, the way human behavior is shaped by observation and imitation of others. He noticed that compulsive behaviors often clustered in families and communities, suggesting that these patterns were learned and transmitted socially rather than being purely individual phenomena. The French Enlightenment brought its own contributions to addiction understanding. Denis Diderot, working on his massive encyclopedia, commissioned articles about various forms of compulsive behavior that represented the most advanced understanding of the time. These encyclopedia entries combined medical observation, philosophical reflection, and social analysis in ways that created remarkably nuanced pictures of addiction. Diderot himself struggled with what he called the tyranny of intellectual appetite, a compulsive need for mental stimulation that interfered with his ability to maintain relationships or complete practical tasks.
His honest self-examination in his private journals provides insight into how addiction can manifest in seemingly positive behaviors when taken to extremes. The Marquis de Condorcet, writing during the French Revolution, developed perhaps the most optimistic Enlightenment view of addiction recovery. Condorcet believed passionately in human perfectibility, the idea that through education, social reform, and scientific progress, most forms of human suffering could eventually be eliminated. While this optimism might seem naive from our modern perspective, it led to innovative approaches to addiction treatment that emphasized education, environmental modification, and social support. Condorcet established some of the first publicly funded treatment programs in Paris based on his belief that addiction was largely a product of ignorance and poor social conditions. His programs combined medical care with education about the effects of various substances, training in practical life skills, and assistance in finding meaningful employment. While Condorcet's belief in easy solutions proved overly optimistic, his emphasis on comprehensive, publicly supported treatment established important precedents. The Enlightenment period also brought increased attention to what we now call the neuroscience of addiction, though 18th century scientists had very different language for these phenomena. David Hartley, an English physician and philosopher, developed one of the first theories about how repeated behaviors create what he called associations in the nervous system. Working in his study in Bath, surrounded by medical texts and philosophical treatises, Hartley proposed that the nervous system operated through vibrations that could become strengthened through repetition. When someone repeatedly used a substance or engaged in a behavior, Hartley theorized, it created stronger and stronger vibratory associations that made that behavior more likely in the future.
Dr. Anne Toft, one of the few female physicians practicing in 18th century London, kept detailed private notes about her female patients struggling with what she called nervous disorders with compulsive elements. Her observations, preserved in private letters to other female physicians, revealed sophisticated understanding of how social restrictions on women's lives could contribute to the development of addictive patterns. Her treatment approaches emphasized expanding women's opportunities for meaningful activity, social connection, and creative expression, interventions that we now know are crucial for addiction recovery. The Enlightenment period also brought new spiritual approaches to addiction that attempted to integrate religious insight with scientific understanding. Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish theologian and scientist, developed a theory of addiction that combined Christian mysticism with early psychological observation. Swedenborg proposed that addiction represented a kind of spiritual inversion, natural human loves becoming twisted toward harmful objects. He believed that recovery required not just behavioral change, but spiritual transformation, a reorientation of the heart toward healthy loves. His treatment approaches combined traditional spiritual practices with what we might now recognize as cognitive therapy and community support. Swedenborg's followers established some of the first recovery communities that explicitly combined spiritual practice with practical life skills training. These communities, scattered throughout Sweden, England, and colonial America, provided models for later developments in faith-based addiction treatment. As the Enlightenment period reached its culmination in the late 18th century, a remarkable synthesis was beginning to emerge. The period's emphasis on reason and scientific observation had led to unprecedented understanding of addiction as a medical and psychological phenomenon. Its social consciousness had revealed the environmental factors that contributed to these problems. Its optimism about human potential had created hope that these ancient struggles could be overcome through better knowledge and more humane treatment. But perhaps most importantly, the Enlightenment had established the principle that addiction deserved serious scientific study rather than moral condemnation. This shift in perspective, from seeing addiction as evidence of moral weakness to seeing it as a complex phenomenon worthy of compassionate investigation, created the foundation for all future advances in understanding and treatment. The Enlightenment thinkers also gave us crucial insights about the relationship between individual responsibility and social conditions in addiction. They recognized that while individuals needed to take responsibility for their recovery, society also had obligations to create conditions that made recovery possible and relapse less likely.
This balance between individual agency and social responsibility remains one of the most important frameworks for addiction policy and treatment. As we drift toward the next chapter of our story, carry with you the Enlightenment's gifts, the belief that addiction can be understood through careful observation, that recovery is possible through scientific knowledge combined with compassionate support, and that both individual healing and social reform are necessary for addressing these ancient human struggles. The Age of Enlightenment transformed addiction from a mystery shrouded in shame and superstition into a legitimate subject for scientific study and medical treatment. These thinkers didn't solve the problem of addiction. That remains a work in progress. But they created the intellectual foundations that made all future progress possible. Sleep peacefully, in the knowledge that human understanding of addiction has been growing for centuries, guided by brilliant, compassionate minds who saw these struggles not as evidence of human failure, but as opportunities for deeper understanding and more effective healing. The Enlightenment's light continues to illuminate our path toward better understanding and more effective treatment of these timeless human challenges. The Industrial Revolution's shadow, when progress creates new forms of pain. The year is 1840, and the factory bells of Manchester are calling workers to another 14-hour shift in the cotton mills. Among them walks Mary O'Brien, her hands already stained with machine oil, her lungs heavy with textile dust. In her worn coat pocket, she carries a small brown bottle, laudanum, the opium-based medicine that helps her cope with the pain in her fingers and the ache in her soul. Mary doesn't know it yet, but she's about to become part of the first industrial addiction epidemic, a wave of dependence that will reshape humanity's understanding of these ancient struggles. The Industrial Revolution brought unprecedented changes to human life, and with these changes came new forms of addiction that would challenge everything people thought they understood about compulsive behavior. For the first time in history, large numbers of people were living in crowded cities, working in dangerous factories, separated from traditional family and community supports. The social fabric that had historically protected people from developing severe addictions was rapidly unraveling. Dr. Thomas de Quincey, author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, provided the world with its first detailed literary exploration of addiction from the inside. De Quincey's beautiful, haunting prose took readers into the subjective experience of opium dependence with unprecedented honesty and eloquence.
Hartley's theory, while primitive by modern standards, contained remarkable insights. He understood that addiction involved changes in the nervous system itself, that these changes made recovery difficult, and that effective treatment needed to help people develop new neural associations to replace the old ones. His emphasis on the importance of environment and repetition in shaping these associations anticipated modern understanding of conditioning and neuroplasticity. The German physician Franz Anton Mesmer, working in Vienna and later Paris, developed theories about what he called animal magnetism that influenced early understanding of addiction treatment. Mesmer believed that healing involved restoring the natural flow of vital forces through the body, and that many forms of compulsive behavior resulted from blockages or imbalances in these forces. While Mesmer's theories about animal magnetism proved scientifically unfounded, his treatment methods produced genuine results for some patients struggling with compulsive behaviors. Mesmer's sessions involved what we would now recognize as elements of hypnosis, group therapy, and mindfulness practice. His emphasis on the power of suggestion and the importance of the therapeutic relationship established principles that remain central to addiction treatment. The Enlightenment also brought new attention to the role of women in understanding and treating addiction. While women were largely excluded from formal medical training, they often served as informal healers and counselors in their communities. Many of the most effective early addiction treatments were developed by women working outside official medical institutions. Madame de Pompadour, the influential mistress of Louis XV, privately funded research into what she called diseases of excess, after observing the self-destructive patterns of behavior common in the French court. Working with sympathetic physicians, she developed treatment approaches that combine medical care with what we might now call lifestyle intervention. Changes in diet, exercise, social activities, and daily routines designed to support recovery. The Enlightenment period also saw the emergence of what we might consider the first addiction memoirs, written specifically to help others. These autobiographical accounts, published anonymously or pseudonymously, provided detailed descriptions of the subjective experience of addiction and recovery. They offered hope to others struggling with similar patterns and contributed to growing understanding of the psychological dimensions of these conditions. One particularly influential memoir published in London in 1788 under the title Confessions of a Reformed Drunkard described the author's descent into alcoholism and gradual recovery in language that was both literarily sophisticated and psychologically acute. The author describes craving as a thirst that water cannot quench, a hunger that food cannot satisfy, a restlessness that no comfort can ease. This memoir also provided one of the first detailed descriptions of what we now call the cycle of addiction. Each morning I would wake with firm resolve, each evening I would fail. Each failure deepened my despair, each despair strengthened my need for the very substance that had caused it. I was trapped in a prison of my own making, yet I knew not how to escape. The Enlightenment brought new emphasis on the importance of environment in shaping human behavior. Philosophers like John Locke argued that humans were essentially blank slates, shaped entirely by their experiences and environment. This environmental determinism led to new interest in how social conditions might contribute to or prevent addictive behaviors. The famous English prison reformer John Howard spent years documenting conditions in prisons throughout Europe, and his observations included detailed notes about patterns of substance use among inmates. Howard noticed that prisons with better conditions, adequate food, meaningful work, educational opportunities, and humane treatment, had lower rates of what he called destructive habits among their populations. Howard's observations led him to advocate for what we might now call therapeutic communities, structured environments designed to support positive behavior change. His model programs combine work therapy, education, peer support, and gradual reintegration into society. While Howard was primarily concerned with general prison reform, his approaches proved particularly effective for inmates struggling with compulsive behaviors. The Enlightenment also brought increased attention to the economic dimensions of addiction. Adam Smith and other early economists began to analyze how the production, distribution, and marketing of potentially addictive substances influenced consumption patterns. They developed some of the first theories about how commercial interests might sometimes conflict with public health. Smith observed that merchants had strong financial incentives to increase consumption of their products, even when those products might be harmful when used excessively. This led him to advocate for government regulation of certain substances, not to eliminate their use entirely, but to create conditions where they could be used more safely. Smith's analysis laid groundwork for modern approaches to addiction policy that try to balance individual freedom with public health concerns. The period also saw significant advances in understanding addiction among women, though these insights often remained hidden within private medical practices and informal networks of female support. Enlightenment physicians began to recognize that women's patterns of compulsive behavior were often different from men's, more likely to involve prescription medicines, eating behaviors, or what we might now call emotional shopping.
The opium eater, De Quincey wrote in his gentle flowing style, loses none of his moral sensibilities or aspirations. He wishes and longs as earnestly as ever to realize what he believes possible, but his intellectual apprehension of what is possible infinitely outruns his power not of execution only, but even of power to attempt. This observation, that addiction involves a tragic gap between understanding and ability, would become central to modern psychological theories. De Quincey also provided the first detailed description of what we now call the progressive nature of addiction. He described how his opium use began as medicine for genuine pain, gradually became a source of pleasure and creativity, then slowly transformed into a necessity he could not do without. His account traces the subtle psychological changes that occur as voluntary use becomes compulsive behavior. Most movingly, De Quincey described the isolation that addiction created.
I found myself isolated from all the world. My friends were still there, but I could no longer reach them through the transparent but impermeable wall that my condition had erected between us. This description of the loneliness of addiction, being surrounded by people yet fundamentally disconnected, remains one of the most accurate characterizations of the addicted experience. The Industrial Revolution also brought new substances and new forms of addiction. The mass production and distribution systems that made the revolution possible also made drugs more widely available than ever before. Opium, cocaine, and various patent medicines containing addictive substances became readily available in pharmacies, grocery stores, and through mail-order catalogs. Perhaps more significantly, the Industrial Revolution created new psychological and social conditions that made people more vulnerable to addiction. Factory work was often mind-numbingly repetitive, dangerous, and devoid of the meaning and community connection that had characterized traditional agricultural work. Workers found themselves living in crowded, polluted cities far from extended family and traditional support systems. Dr. Friedrich Engels, better known as Karl Marx's collaborator, spent years documenting the living conditions of industrial workers in Manchester and other factory towns. His observations include some of the first systematic documentation of how social conditions influence addiction patterns. Engels noted that workers in the most dangerous, poorly paid jobs were most likely to develop problems with alcohol and other substances. But Engels went beyond simple documentation to develop a theory about the relationship between alienation and addiction. He observed that when people are separated from the products of their labor, from meaningful community connections, and from a sense of purpose and dignity, they often turn to substances or behaviors that provide temporary relief from what he called the pain of existence under capitalism. Engels's insights were remarkably prescient. Modern research has confirmed that social isolation, meaningless work, economic insecurity, and lack of control over one's environment are all significant risk factors for developing addiction. His analysis helped shift understanding away from purely individual explanations towards recognition of the social conditions that make addiction more or less likely. The Industrial Revolution also brought the first mass-produced medications containing addictive substances. Patent medicines, sold with grand claims about their healing properties, often contain significant amounts of opium, alcohol, or cocaine. These medicines were marketed to ordinary families as treatments for everything from headaches to childhood teething pain. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, one of the most popular patent medicines of the 19th century, contained morphine and was marketed specifically for fussy babies and young children. Cocaine was sold as a treatment for depression and fatigue. Heroin, when it was first synthesized by the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in 1897, was marketed as a safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine for treating pain and cough. These developments created what historians now recognize as the first medically induced addiction epidemic. Thousands of people, often women and elderly individuals with legitimate medical complaints, became dependent on medications that were prescribed or recommended by physicians who didn't understand their addictive potential. Dr. Leslie Keeley, working in Illinois in the late 19th century, became one of the first physicians to recognize the scope of what he called the medicine habit. He observed that many of his patients had become addicted not through recreational use, but through medical treatment. This observation led him to develop some of the first treatment approaches specifically designed for medically induced addiction. Keeley's treatment centers, known as Keeley Institutes, pioneered several approaches that remain important today. They provided medical detoxification in safe, supportive environments. They combined medical treatment with what Keeley called moral therapy, counseling approaches that addressed the shame and self-blame that often accompanied addiction. And they created aftercare programs that helped people maintain their recovery after returning to their home communities. As the 19th century drew to a close, the stage was set for the modern era of addiction science. The Industrial Revolution had created both new forms of addiction and new tools for studying them.
It had revealed the social dimensions of these problems while also advancing medical understanding of their biological aspects. Most importantly, it had established that addiction was a legitimate subject for scientific investigation and medical treatment, rather than simply a moral or spiritual issue. The gentle lesson of this industrial chapter is that human progress often comes with unexpected costs. The same forces that liberated people from traditional constraints also removed traditional protections. The same innovations that created unprecedented prosperity also created new forms of suffering. Understanding addiction requires understanding these broader historical forces, recognizing how social and technological changes can create new vulnerabilities while also providing new tools for healing. As you settle into sleep, imagine the gaslight flickering in a 19th century physician's office, where a doctor sits with a patient, listening with genuine compassion to a story of struggle and hope. Feel the warmth of that lamplight, the comfort of that medical attention, the hope that comes from being truly understood. The Industrial Revolution, for all its challenges, gave us the beginning of modern, scientific, compassionate approaches to addiction treatment. Rest in the knowledge that each historical period has contributed to our growing understanding of these ancient struggles. The Industrial Revolution's gift was the recognition that addiction is influenced by social conditions, that it can be studied scientifically, and that it deserves medical treatment rather than moral condemnation. These insights, developed in the midst of unprecedented social change, continue to guide our approaches to understanding and treating addiction today. The dawn of modern medicine, laboratory light, and the chemistry of craving. The year is 1929, and in a modest laboratory at the University of Edinburgh, a young researcher named Roy Grinker is peering through a microscope at brain tissue from a patient who died of what doctors are now calling chronic alcoholism. The tissue shows distinctive patterns of damage, scarred areas, abnormal cell formations, changes in the delicate architecture of the brain itself. For the first time in human history, scientists are beginning to see physical evidence of how addiction changes the very structure of the mind. Dr. Grinker adjusts the focus on his microscope and makes careful notes in his laboratory journal. He's documenting something revolutionary. Addiction isn't just a psychological or spiritual condition, but a biological one that leaves measurable changes in the brain. This observation will help transform addiction from a moral judgment to a medical diagnosis, opening new pathways for understanding and treatment. But the dawn of modern addiction medicine didn't begin in laboratories. It began in the lived experiences of people struggling with these patterns and the physicians courageous enough to listen to their stories with scientific curiosity rather than moral judgment. Dr. William Silkworth, working at Towns Hospital in New York City in the 1930s, spent years treating wealthy patients suffering from alcoholism. What made Dr. Silkworth's work revolutionary wasn't his medical techniques. The addiction medications we know today didn't exist yet, but his radical compassion and scientific mindset. He was among the first physicians to insist that alcoholism was a genuine medical condition rather than a moral failing. Silkworth observed that his patients, despite having every material advantage and strong motivation to recover, repeatedly failed when they tried to stop drinking through willpower alone. This led him to develop what he called the allergy theory of alcoholism, the idea that some people have a biological predisposition that makes them unable to drink safely, just as some people are allergic to shellfish or pollen. While Silkworth's allergy metaphor wasn't scientifically precise, it contained important insights. He recognized that addiction involved biological factors beyond individual control, that these factors varied from person to person, and that effective treatment needed to acknowledge these biological realities rather than simply relying on moral exhortation.
Dr. Silkworth's approach to treatment was correspondingly medical and compassionate. He provided careful detoxification, nutritional support for the physical damage caused by chronic alcohol use, and what he called education about the disease. Most importantly, he treated his patients with the same respect and clinical attention he would give to someone suffering from diabetes or heart disease.
Silkworth's work came to the attention of a stockbroker named Bill Wilson and a surgeon named Bob Smith, both of whom were struggling with alcoholism themselves. The medical framework that Silkworth provided became crucial for the development of Alcoholics Anonymous, not because it was scientifically perfect, but because it offered a non-moral explanation for addiction that made recovery psychologically possible. The early 20th century also brought the first systematic studies of what we now call the neuroscience of addiction. Dr. Santiago Jamón y Cajal, working in Madrid and later Barcelona, revolutionized understanding of the nervous system through his beautiful, detailed drawings of individual nerve cells. Cajal's work revealed that the brain was composed of discrete cells, neurons, that communicated through chemical signals. Cajal's insights about neural communication laid the groundwork for understanding how addictive substances work at the cellular level. He showed that the nervous system was not a static structure, but a dynamic network that could change and adapt throughout life. This concept of neural plasticity would eventually prove crucial for understanding both how addiction develops and how recovery is possible. Working in his laboratory in the early hours of the morning, when the light was best for his microscopic observations, Cajal made detailed drawings of what he called the butterfly neurons, delicate cells whose wing-like processes reached out to connect with other cells throughout the brain. He began to theorize that learning and memory involved changes in the strength of these connections and that repeated experiences could literally rewire the brain. While Cajal couldn't have known it at the time, he was documenting the biological basis of addiction. The neural plasticity he observed, the brain's ability to strengthen certain connections through repetition, is the same process that makes addiction so powerful and so difficult to overcome. But it's also the same process that makes recovery possible, as new, healthier patterns can gradually replace old, destructive ones. The early 20th century also brought the first systematic pharmacological studies of addictive substances. German chemists, working with remarkable precision and dedication, began to isolate and purify the active compounds in opium, coca leaves, and other psychoactive plants. Their work led to the development of morphine, cocaine, heroin, and other substances that would profoundly influence human understanding of both pain relief and addiction. Dr. Felix Hoffmann, working at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in 1897, synthesized heroin in an attempt to create a safer alternative to morphine for treating pain and cough. The tragic irony that heroin turned out to be more addictive than morphine illustrates the complex challenges faced by early addiction researchers. They were working with good intentions and limited knowledge, making discoveries that sometimes helped and sometimes harmed. These early pharmacological studies revealed something crucial about addiction. The same substances that could provide profound relief from physical and emotional pain could also create powerful dependencies that were extremely difficult to break. This paradox that some of our most effective medicines are also our most dangerous drugs continues to challenge addiction medicine today. The world wars of the early 20th century brought unfortunate natural experiments in addiction and recovery. Millions of soldiers were exposed to morphine for treating combat injuries, creating large populations of medically induced addiction. But the wars also revealed something hopeful. Many soldiers who became dependent on morphine in medical settings were able to recover when they returned to civilian life with adequate support. Dr. Walter Freeman, working with military physicians during World War I, documented what he called the environmental theory of addiction maintenance. He observed that soldiers who remained in military hospitals, surrounded by other addicted patients and with easy access to morphine, had much higher rates of continued use than soldiers who returned home to supportive families and meaningful civilian roles. This observation led to one of the first modern insights about the importance of environment in addiction recovery. Freeman documented that the same biological condition, physical dependence on morphine, had very different outcomes depending on the social and physical environment in which recovery took place. This led to new treatment approaches that emphasized changing life circumstances rather than just addressing the immediate substance use. The interwar period brought remarkable advances in understanding the psychology of addiction. Dr. Carl Jung, working in his quiet practice in Zurich, began to develop theories about what he called spiritual thirst and its relationship to compulsive behaviors. Jung observed that many of his patients struggling with alcoholism seemed to be searching for something transcendent, a sense of meaning, connection, or transformation that they were trying to find through drinking. Jung's famous correspondence with Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, articulated this insight beautifully. His craving for alcohol was the equivalent, on a low level, of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. The only right and legitimate way to such an experience is that it happens to you in reality, and it can only happen to you when you walk on a path which leads you to higher understanding. This spiritual dimension of addiction recovery, while difficult to study scientifically, proved crucial for many people's healing. Jung's insight that addiction often represents misdirected spiritual hunger led to treatment approaches that emphasized finding authentic sources of meaning and transcendence rather than just eliminating problematic behaviors. Dr. Sigmund Freud, working in Vienna, brought psychoanalytic insight to understanding addiction patterns. Freud's own struggles with cocaine dependence gave him personal insight into the subjective experience of addiction, though he was often reluctant to discuss this openly. His theoretical work suggested that addictive behaviors often represented unconscious attempts to resolve childhood emotional wounds. Freud observed that many of his patients with compulsive behaviors had histories of early trauma, emotional neglect, or disrupted attachment relationships. This led him to develop treatment approaches that focused on uncovering and resolving these underlying psychological wounds rather than just addressing the surface behaviors. While Freud's specific theories about addiction proved too simplistic, his emphasis on the importance of early childhood experiences and unconscious motivation laid important groundwork for later psychological understanding. His recognition that addiction often serves psychological functions, reducing anxiety, numbing painful emotions, providing a sense of control, remains central to modern treatment approaches.
The 1930s brought the establishment of the first modern research institutes dedicated specifically to studying addiction. The Research Council on Problems of Alcohol, founded in 1938 with funding from the Carnegie Corporation, brought together physicians, psychologists, sociologists, and anthropologists to study alcoholism from multiple perspectives simultaneously. This interdisciplinary approach produced insights that no single field could have generated alone. Medical researchers documented the physical effects of chronic alcohol use on the liver, brain, and other organs. Psychologists studied the mental and emotional patterns associated with alcoholism. Sociologists examined how family dynamics, social class, and cultural factors influenced drinking patterns. Anthropologists compared addiction patterns across different cultures and historical periods. Dr. E.M. Jelinek, working with this research council, produced some of the first systematic scientific studies of alcoholism progression. Jelinek surveyed thousands of people in recovery and documented consistent patterns in how alcoholism typically develops: initial experimentation, regular use, increased tolerance, loss of control, severe consequences, and eventual recovery or death. Jelinek's work was revolutionary because it provided the first scientific evidence that alcoholism follows predictable patterns regardless of individual moral character. His documentation of the progressive nature of alcoholism helped establish it as a legitimate medical condition with characteristic symptoms and course, just like diabetes or heart disease. But Jelinek also recognized important individual variations in addiction patterns. He identified several different types of alcoholism, each with distinctive characteristics and requiring different treatment approaches. This insight that addiction is not a single condition, but a family of related disorders, remains important for modern personalized medicine approaches. The 1940s brought breakthroughs in understanding the brain chemistry of addiction. Dr. Arvid Carlsson, working in Sweden, began to identify specific neurotransmitter systems that seemed to be involved in reward, motivation, and addiction. His research on dopamine, though that name wouldn't come until later, revealed that the brain has specialized circuits for processing pleasure and reward. Carlsson's work showed that addictive substances and behaviors all seem to affect these same reward circuits, though through different mechanisms. This discovery suggested that addiction might represent a hijacking of natural brain systems that had evolved to motivate survival behaviors like eating, reproduction, and social bonding. The mid-20th century also brought the first controlled studies of addiction treatment effectiveness. Dr. Griffith Edwards, working in London, established some of the first research protocols for testing whether addiction treatments actually worked. Edwards insisted that treatment claims needed to be supported by careful measurement of outcomes over time, not just testimonials or clinical impressions. Edwards's research revealed that recovery rates varied dramatically depending on the type of treatment provided, the severity of the addiction, and the social resources available to support recovery. His research established the importance of evidence-based treatment, approaches that had been proven effective through scientific study rather than just traditional practice or theoretical appeal. The period also brought new understanding of the genetic dimensions of addiction. Dr. Donald Goodwin, studying families affected by alcoholism, documented that children of alcoholic parents were at significantly higher risk of developing alcoholism themselves, even when they were raised by non-alcoholic adoptive families. This research provided the first clear evidence that genetic factors contribute to addiction vulnerability. Goodwin's adoption studies revealed that genetic vulnerability to addiction didn't determine destiny. Environmental factors remained crucial. Children with genetic risk who were raised in stable, supportive environments had much lower rates of addiction than those raised in chaotic or neglectful environments. This research established the modern understanding that addiction results from complex interactions between genetic predisposition and environmental influences. The development of psychopharmacology in the 1950s brought new tools for understanding and treating addiction. Dr. Nathan Klein, working at Rockland State Hospital in New York, began experimenting with medications that could reduce cravings or block the effects of addictive substances. While early addiction medications had limited effectiveness, they provided crucial proof that the brain changes associated with addiction could potentially be reversed or managed through medical intervention. The 1960s brought revolutionary changes in addiction treatment philosophy. Dr. Vincent Dole and Dr. Marie Niswander, working in New York, developed methadone maintenance treatment for heroin addiction. Their approach was controversial because it involved giving addicted individuals a different opioid medication rather than trying to achieve complete abstinence.
Dole and Niswander's research revealed that many people with severe opioid addiction could live normal, productive lives when provided with medically supervised methadone. Their work challenged the assumption that addiction treatment must always aim for complete abstinence and established the legitimacy of harm reduction approaches that prioritize improving quality of life over achieving perfect sobriety. This period also brought new recognition of the diversity of addiction patterns and treatment needs. Dr. Mark Schuckett, studying alcoholism in different populations, documented that addiction manifested differently across gender, age, cultural, and socioeconomic lines. His research established that effective treatment needed to be tailored to individual circumstances rather than applying one-size-fits-all approaches. The modern medical era also brought increased attention to what we now call dual diagnosis, the recognition that addiction often co-occurs with other mental health conditions. Dr. Kenneth Minkoff, working with psychiatric patients in the 1980s, documented that people with conditions like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and PTSD had much higher rates of addiction than the general population. This research revealed that addiction was often a form of self-medication, an attempt to treat untreated mental health symptoms with substances or behaviors that provided temporary relief. This insight led to integrated treatment approaches that addressed both addiction and underlying mental health conditions simultaneously.
The development of brain imaging technology in the late 20th century provided the first direct visual evidence of how addiction changes the brain. Dr. Nora Volkov, using PET scans and later MRI technology, showed that chronic substance use creates measurable changes in brain structure and function, particularly in areas involved in decision-making, impulse control, and reward processing. Volkov's brain imaging studies reveal that addiction involves what she called a pathology of motivation, changes in brain circuits that make drug-seeking behavior compulsive while reducing motivation for other rewarding activities. Her work provided biological validation for what people in recovery had long reported, that addiction involves a fundamental change in how the brain responds to rewards and makes decisions. But Volkov's research also provided hope. Brain imaging studies showed that many of the changes associated with addiction could be reversed through sustained recovery. The brain's plasticity, its ability to form new connections and pathways, meant that the biological changes that supported addiction could be gradually replaced by changes that supported healthy behavior. The modern era also brought new understanding of the developmental aspects of addiction. Dr. Linda Spear's research on adolescent brain development revealed that teenagers are neurologically more vulnerable to developing addiction than adults because their brains are still developing, particularly in areas responsible for impulse control and long-term planning. This research helped explain why addiction so often begins during adolescence and why prevention efforts need to be targeted toward young people. It also led to specialized treatment approaches for adolescents that take into account their unique developmental needs and capabilities. The late 20th century brought unprecedented advances in addiction pharmacology. Researchers developed medications that could block the effects of addictive substances, like naltrexone for alcohol and opioids, reduce cravings, like bupropion for tobacco, or provide safer alternatives for maintenance treatment, like buprenorphine for opioid addiction. These pharmacological advances represented a fundamental shift in addiction treatment. For the first time, physicians had medical tools that could directly address the biological aspects of addiction rather than relying solely on psychological or social interventions. This medical approach helped reduce stigma and made treatment more accessible to people who might not have sought help through traditional counseling or peer support programs. The modern medical era also brought sophisticated understanding of addiction as a chronic disease requiring long-term management rather than acute treatment aimed at curing the condition. Dr. Alan Leshner's influential work at the National Institute on Drug Abuse established the modern medical model that views addiction as a chronic, relapsing condition similar to diabetes or hypertension.
This chronic disease model had profound implications for treatment approaches. Rather than expecting permanent recovery after a single treatment episode, medical professionals began to develop long-term care models that anticipated and planned for the possibility of relapse while providing ongoing support for sustained recovery. The model also emphasized the importance of treating addiction as a whole person condition, rather than just focusing on substance use. Modern medical approaches address the physical health problems that often accompany addiction, the mental health conditions that frequently co-occur with it, and the social problems that both contribute to and result from addictive behaviors. But perhaps the most important development of the modern medical era has been the integration of scientific understanding with lived experience and peer support. Organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and other mutual aid societies have provided millions of people with effective recovery support based on shared experience rather than professional expertise. Modern addiction medicine has learned to value both scientific research and experiential wisdom. The most effective treatment programs combine evidence-based medical interventions with peer support, individual counseling, family therapy, and community-based recovery support services. This integrative approach recognizes that addiction affects every aspect of a person's life, and that recovery requires comprehensive support addressing biological, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of healing. Recent decades have also brought new understanding of what researchers call natural recovery, the fact that many people overcome addiction without formal treatment. Studies of natural recovery have revealed that healing often involves the same elements, whether it occurs within formal treatment or through personal and social resources: motivation for change, social support, new sources of meaning and purpose, and gradual development of new life patterns. The modern era has also brought increased recognition of addiction as a social justice issue. Research has documented that addiction treatment access and outcomes are significantly influenced by factors like race, gender, socioeconomic status, and geographic location. This research has led to new emphasis on addressing health disparities and ensuring that effective treatment is available to all people who need it. Dr. Carl Hart's groundbreaking research on drug policy and social determinants of addiction has revealed how social conditions like poverty, discrimination, limited educational opportunities, and community trauma create vulnerability to addiction while also limiting access to effective treatment. His work emphasizes that addressing addiction effectively requires addressing broader social inequities. As we reach the present moment in our gentle journey through addiction understanding, we find ourselves inheriting the wisdom of centuries of human observation, scientific investigation, and compassionate treatment development. Modern addiction medicine combines insights from neuroscience, psychology, sociology, pharmacology, and spiritual traditions to create more comprehensive and effective approaches to understanding and treating these ancient human struggles. The modern medical understanding of addiction rests on several key insights that have emerged from this long historical journey. Addiction is a complex, chronic condition involving changes in brain structure and function. It typically develops through interactions between genetic vulnerability, environmental factors, and substance or behavior exposure. Recovery is possible, but often requires comprehensive, long-term support addressing biological, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of healing. Most importantly, modern addiction medicine emphasizes that people struggling with addiction deserve the same compassionate, evidence-based care that we provide for any other medical condition. The stigma and moral judgment that historically surrounded addiction are gradually being replaced by scientific understanding and therapeutic optimism. As you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself in a modern addiction medicine clinic where compassionate physicians combine the latest scientific knowledge with time-honored wisdom about human healing. Feel the warmth of that clinical environment where your struggles are met with understanding rather than judgment, where your recovery is supported by both cutting-edge medicine and ancient wisdom about human transformation. The dawn of modern medicine has brought us unprecedented tools for understanding and treating addiction, but it has also preserved the fundamental insights that have guided healing throughout history. That addiction involves the whole person, that recovery requires community support, that healing is always possible, and that every person struggling with these patterns deserves compassion, respect, and hope. The neuroscience revolution. Mapping the brain's secret gardens. It's 3 a.m. in a laboratory at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and Dr. Eric Nestler is hunched over a computer screen watching real-time images of a living brain respond to stimuli. The year is 1995, and the technology that allows scientists to peer into the working brain without harming the patient has finally arrived. On the screen before Dr. Nestler, colorful patterns bloom and fade like flowers in a time-lapse garden, showing how neurons fire, connect, and adapt in response to experiences. What Dr. Nestler is witnessing is nothing short of revolutionary. The first direct observations of how addiction literally reshapes the brain's landscape. Each time his research participant, a volunteer in recovery from cocaine addiction, sees images associated with drug use, specific brain regions light up like constellations against the night sky. These patterns are teaching us that addiction isn't just about willpower or moral choice, but about fundamental changes in the brain's reward and decision-making systems. Picture the brain as a vast city at night, with millions of lights representing active neurons. In a healthy brain, this city has balanced neighborhoods, some areas dedicated to processing rewards,
others to making decisions, others to forming memories, and others to controlling impulses. The traffic between these neighborhoods flows smoothly, creating the complex symphony of human consciousness and choice.
But in addiction, this neural city begins to change. The reward neighborhoods become hyperactive, lighting up like Times Square whenever addiction-related cues appear. Meanwhile, the decision-making neighborhoods become dimmer, less able to override the urgent signals coming from the reward centers. The memory neighborhoods become fixated on drug-related experiences, replaying them with vivid intensity. And the impulse control neighborhoods struggle to maintain order against the overwhelming signals from other parts of the brain. Dr. Volkoff's pioneering brain imaging research revealed that these changes occur in predictable patterns across different types of addiction. Whether someone is addicted to cocaine, alcohol, gambling, or even social media, the same basic brain circuits are affected. This discovery suggested that addiction represents a common biological pathway that can be triggered by many different substances and behaviors. But perhaps more importantly, Dr. Volkoff's research showed that these brain changes are not permanent. Brain imaging studies of people in long-term recovery revealed that many of the changes associated with active addiction gradually normalize over time. The reward system learns to respond to healthy stimuli again. Decision-making areas regain their ability to override impulses. Memory systems become less dominated by addiction-related content. This research provided biological hope for recovery. The same neural plasticity that makes addiction so powerful also makes healing possible. The brain that has learned to prioritize addictive substances or behaviors can learn new patterns that support health and well-being. Dr. Anna Rose Childress, working at the University of Pennsylvania, developed some of the most elegant research paradigms for studying craving and cue reactivity. Her laboratory became a place where the subjective experience of craving could be measured objectively through brain imaging, heart rate monitoring, and other physiological indicators. Childress's research revealed that craving involves the same brain circuits that process hunger, thirst, and sexual desire, fundamental survival drives that have been essential for human evolution. This insight helped explain why addiction feels so urgent and compelling, because it hijacks brain systems that are designed to motivate behaviors necessary for survival and reproduction. But Childress also discovered something hopeful. The brain's response to addiction cues could be modified through various interventions: mindfulness meditation, cognitive therapy, and even certain medications could reduce the intensity of cue-induced craving. This research provided scientific validation for treatment approaches that help people develop new responses to triggering situations. Dr. Mary Jean Creek's research on the genetics of addiction revealed that people inherit different versions of genes that influence how their brains process rewards, handle stress, and metabolize various substances. Creek's work showed that some people are born with brain chemistry that makes them more likely to find certain substances intensely rewarding, while others seem naturally protected against developing addiction. This genetic research helped explain why addiction runs in families and why some people can use potentially addictive substances without problems, while others quickly develop dependencies. But genetic research also revealed the crucial importance of environmental factors. Having genetic vulnerability doesn't guarantee that someone will develop addiction. It just makes them more susceptible if other risk factors are present. Similarly, people without genetic vulnerability can still develop addiction if they're exposed to sufficient environmental stress, trauma, or substance availability. Dr. Rajita Sinha's research at Yale has revealed how stress affects the brain's reward and decision-making systems in ways that increase addiction vulnerability. Her studies show that chronic stress actually remodels brain circuits, making them more responsive to addictive substances and less responsive to natural rewards like food, social connection, and accomplishment. Sinha's work has profound implications for both addiction prevention and treatment.
It suggests that addressing chronic stress through meditation, therapy, social support, or policy interventions that reduce structural stressors should be a central component of addiction prevention and treatment programs. The research on stress and addiction has also revealed important insights about trauma. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's work on trauma and the brain has shown that early childhood trauma, combat exposure, sexual assault, and other severe stressors create changes in brain development that increase addiction vulnerability while also making recovery more challenging. This trauma research has led to new treatment approaches that address both addiction and underlying trauma simultaneously. These trauma-informed treatments recognize that many addictive behaviors represent attempts to cope with the lasting effects of traumatic experiences, and that successful recovery often requires healing these deeper wounds. The neuroscience revolution has also brought new understanding of how different substances affect the brain in distinctive ways. Dr. Volkoff's research has shown that cocaine creates rapid, intense changes in dopamine levels that fade quickly, leading to frequent redosing. Alcohol affects multiple neurotransmitter systems simultaneously, creating complex patterns of intoxication and withdrawal. Opioids affect the brain's natural pain relief systems, leading to both physical dependence and psychological attachment. These insights have led to more sophisticated, substance-specific treatment approaches. Instead of treating all addictions the same way, modern medicine recognizes that cocaine addiction, alcohol addiction, and opioid addiction each require different medical interventions, though they may benefit from similar psychological and social supports. Recent neuroscience research has also revealed the importance of what scientists call cognitive control networks, brain circuits that are responsible for planning, decision-making, and inhibiting impulses. Dr. Rita Goldstein's research has shown that these networks are significantly impaired in addiction and that strengthening them through cognitive training, meditation, or other interventions can improve recovery outcomes.
This research has led to new treatment approaches that specifically target cognitive control. Cognitive bias modification therapy helps people develop automatic responses that favor recovery choices over addiction choices. Mindfulness-based interventions strengthen brain networks involved in attention and emotional regulation. Working memory training helps people hold recovery goals in mind even when experiencing strong cravings. The neuroscience revolution has also brought new understanding of the social brain and its relationship to addiction. Dr. Matthew Lieberman's research has revealed that social connection and social rejection affect the same brain circuits that process physical pleasure and pain. This research helps explain why social isolation is such a strong risk factor for addiction, and why social support is so crucial for recovery. Brain imaging studies have shown that people in recovery who have strong social support networks show different patterns of brain activation than those who are socially isolated. Social connection appears to strengthen the brain's natural reward systems and improve the function of decision-making areas, creating biological protection against relapse. Recent research has also revealed the importance of what scientists call meaning-making networks in the brain, circuits involved in finding purpose and significance in experience. Dr. David Eagleman's work has shown that these networks are often underactive in addiction, and that interventions that help people find meaning and purpose in recovery activate these circuits in ways that support sustained healing. This research provides scientific validation for what addiction treatment has long recognized, that recovery requires more than just stopping substance use or problematic behaviors. It requires developing new sources of meaning, purpose, and connection that engage the brain's natural systems for motivation and reward. The neuroscience revolution has also brought new understanding of the role of habit formation in addiction. Dr. Anne Grabiel's research on the basal ganglia has revealed how repeated behaviors become automated, moving from conscious choice to unconscious habit. This research helps explain why addiction can feel so automatic, and why breaking addictive patterns requires developing new habits rather than just making better decisions. Grabiel's work has led to treatment approaches that focus on habit modification, systematically replacing addiction-related habits with recovery-supporting habits. These approaches recognize that willpower alone is insufficient to overcome well-established patterns, and that recovery requires patient, consistent practice in developing new automatic responses. As we near the end of our journey through the neuroscience revolution, we find ourselves with unprecedented understanding of addiction as a brain disease, but also with renewed appreciation for the psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of recovery. Modern neuroscience hasn't eliminated the importance of these other factors, it has revealed how they work at the biological level to support or undermine brain health. The neuroscience revolution has given us powerful new tools for understanding and treating addiction, but it has also humbled us with recognition of how complex these conditions really are. The brain changes associated with addiction involve multiple neurotransmitter systems, various brain regions, and complex interactions between genetic and environmental factors. This complexity means that effective treatment requires sophisticated, individualized approaches rather than simple solutions. But the neuroscience revolution has also provided unprecedented hope. For the first time in human history, we can see directly how the brain heals from addiction. We can measure the biological processes that support recovery. We can develop medications and other interventions based on specific understanding of how addiction affects brain function. And we can offer people struggling with addiction scientific evidence that their brains can change, heal, and support new patterns of thinking and behavior. As you prepare for sleep, imagine your own brain as that vast neural city with millions of connections lighting up in complex, beautiful patterns. Know that your brain, like every human brain, has remarkable capacity for change, growth, and healing. The same plasticity that can create problems can also solve them. The same neural networks that can learn destructive patterns can learn healthy ones. Rest in the gentle knowledge that modern neuroscience has confirmed what humans have always hoped, that change is possible, that healing is real, and that every brain has the capacity for transformation. The neuroscience revolution continues to unfold, bringing new insights and new hope with each passing year. As you sleep, your brain is already beginning the nightly process of consolidation and repair, strengthening helpful connections while weakening harmful ones. Trust in your brain's natural wisdom and its remarkable capacity for healing. The digital age paradox: connection and isolation in the modern world. The blue light of a smartphone screen illuminates Sarah's face at 2:47 a.m. as she scrolls endlessly through social media feeds, her thumb moving in the same repetitive motion she's maintained for the past 3 hours. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knows she should sleep. She has work in the morning, and this late-night scrolling is affecting her health, her relationships, her sense of well-being. Yet here she is again, caught in a digital loop that feels both irresistible and completely empty. Sarah doesn't realize it, but she's experiencing the newest form of an ancient human struggle. The technology that promised to connect us to the entire world has created new forms of isolation and compulsion that challenge everything we thought we understood about addiction. The digital age has brought us both unprecedented tools for understanding addiction and unprecedented new forms of addictive behavior. Dr. Anna Lembke, working at Stanford University in the early 21st century, was among the first physicians to recognize that the digital revolution was creating new patterns of compulsive behavior that followed the same neurobiological pathways as traditional substance addiction. Her research revealed that smartphones, social media, video games, and online shopping could trigger the same brain changes that characterize drug and alcohol addiction. Working in her clinic, Dr. Lembke observed patients who described losing hours to their phones, checking social media compulsively throughout the day, feeling anxious when separated from their devices, and continuing digital behaviors despite clear negative consequences. These patterns were so similar to substance addiction that she began applying the same diagnostic criteria and treatment approaches. Dr. Lembke's research revealed that digital technologies are designed to be addictive. Technology companies employed teams of neuroscientists, behavioral economists, and data scientists specifically to make their products as engaging and habit-forming as possible. Features like intermittent reinforcement, unpredictable rewards, social validation, likes and comments, fear of missing out, and personalized algorithms are all designed to trigger the same brain systems that make substances addictive.
This recognition that addiction could be engineered rather than just emerging naturally represented a profound shift in understanding. For the first time in history, human societies were deliberately creating addictive products and marketing them to the general population.
including children and adolescents whose brains were particularly vulnerable to developing compulsive patterns. Dr. Tristan Harris, a former technology executive turned ethicist, spent years documenting how digital technologies exploit psychological vulnerabilities to capture and hold human attention. His research revealed that the business model of most digital platforms depends on maximizing what tech companies call engagement, keeping users on their platforms for as long as possible and bringing them back as frequently as possible. Harris showed that this engagement is achieved through techniques borrowed directly from gambling and substance addiction research. Variable ratio reward schedules, you never know when you'll get a like or comment, loss aversion, fear of missing important information, and social comparison, seeing curated highlights of other people's lives, all trigger psychological responses that can become compulsive. But the digital age paradox runs deeper than just new forms of addiction. The same technologies that create new compulsive behaviors also provide unprecedented tools for understanding and treating all forms of addiction. Smartphone apps can track behavior patterns, provide real-time support during moments of craving, connect people with recovery communities, and deliver evidence-based interventions at the moment they're most needed. Dr. John Torres, working at Harvard Medical School, has pioneered the use of digital therapeutics for addiction treatment. His research has shown that smartphone apps can be as effective as traditional therapy for some aspects of addiction recovery when they're properly designed and integrated with clinical care. Digital therapeutics for addiction might include features like mood tracking, helping people identify emotional triggers for substance use, mindfulness training, guided meditations to manage cravings, peer support, connecting with others in recovery, educational content, learning about addiction and recovery, and crisis intervention, immediate support during high-risk situations. The digital age has also revolutionized addiction research through big data analysis. Researchers can now analyze patterns from millions of people simultaneously, identifying risk factors, treatment responses, and recovery patterns with unprecedented precision. This large-scale analysis has revealed insights that would have been impossible to discover through traditional small-scale studies. Dr. Dana Boyd's research on social media behavior has revealed how digital platforms can either support or undermine addiction recovery depending on how they're used. Her studies show that social media can provide crucial support for people in recovery by connecting them with recovery communities, providing access to educational resources, and offering platforms for sharing recovery experiences and supporting others. But Boyd's research also revealed that social media can trigger relapse by exposing people to substance use cues, promoting unrealistic comparisons with others, creating social pressure to use substances, and facilitating contact with people who are still using. This research has led to new approaches to digital wellness and recovery that help people use technology in ways that support rather than undermine their healing. The digital age has also brought new understanding of how modern life creates conditions that increase addiction vulnerability. Research on digital overwhelm has revealed that constant connectivity, information overload, and the pressure to be always available can create chronic stress that increases susceptibility to various forms of compulsive behavior. Dr. Cal Newport's research on digital minimalism has shown that many people experience significant improvements in mood, focus, and overall well-being when they deliberately reduce their digital consumption and create more space for offline activities, like reading, walking, face-to-face conversation, and creative pursuits. This research suggests that preventing and treating addiction in the digital age requires not just addressing specific problematic behaviors, but also creating overall digital wellness, conscious, intentional relationships with technology that support rather than undermine human flourishing. The COVID-19 pandemic provided an unfortunate natural experiment in how digital isolation affects addiction patterns. Research conducted during lockdowns revealed that many people experienced increases in addictive behaviors, not just substance use, but also gambling, gaming, shopping, and other behavioral addictions. Dr. Sarah Wakeman's research during the pandemic showed that social isolation, economic stress, and disrupted routines created a perfect storm of conditions that increased addiction vulnerability,
while also making treatment harder to access. But the pandemic also accelerated innovations in digital addiction treatment, leading to new models of care that combine virtual therapy, peer support, and medical management. The digital age has also brought new recognition of what researchers call behavioral addictions, compulsive patterns involving activities like gambling, gaming, shopping, sex, work, or exercise that can become as problematic as substance addictions. The inclusion of gambling disorder in official psychiatric diagnostic manuals represents the first formal recognition that addiction can involve behaviors as well as substances. Dr. Mark Potenza's research at Yale has revealed that behavioral addictions involve the same brain circuits as substance addictions and respond to similar treatment approaches. His work has helped establish that addiction is fundamentally about the brain's reward and control systems rather than about specific substances, opening new possibilities for understanding and treating compulsive behaviors of all kinds. The digital age has also brought new appreciation for the role of social connection in addiction and recovery. Research on social media depression has revealed that digital interactions often fail to provide the deep social connection that humans need for emotional well-being. This connection paradox, being more connected than ever, yet feeling increasingly isolated, may contribute to the rising rates of mental health problems and addictive behaviors in developed countries. Dr. Vivek Murthy's research on loneliness as a public health issue has revealed that social isolation has health effects comparable to smoking or obesity and significantly increases risk for developing various forms of addiction. This research has led to new emphasis on building genuine social connection as both a prevention strategy and a crucial component of addiction treatment. The digital age has also brought new understanding of how addiction intersects with other mental health conditions. Large-scale studies using electronic health records have revealed that addiction very commonly co-occurs with depression, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, and other psychiatric conditions. This research has led to more integrated treatment approaches that address multiple conditions simultaneously.
Dr. Kathleen Brady's research on trauma and addiction has shown that addressing underlying trauma is often crucial for successful addiction treatment. Her work has led to widespread adoption of trauma-informed care in addiction treatment, approaches that recognize how trauma affects the brain and behavior, and that create treatment environments that support healing rather than re-traumatization. The digital age has also brought new tools for personalizing addiction treatment. Artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms can analyze vast amounts of data about individual patients to predict which treatments are most likely to be effective for each person. This precision medicine approach to addiction represents a major advance over the one-size-fits-all approaches that dominated earlier eras. Dr. John Crystal's work at Yale has pioneered the use of AI to analyze speech patterns, facial expressions, smartphone usage data, and other digital biomarkers to assess addiction severity and recovery progress. These digital assessments can provide continuous monitoring of recovery status rather than relying on periodic clinical visits, allowing for more timely adjustments to treatment plans. Recent neuroscience research has also revealed the importance of what scientists call default mode network activity in addiction and recovery. This brain network, which is active when we're not focused on specific tasks, is involved in self-reflection, future planning, and moral reasoning. Research has shown that this network is often disrupted in addiction, and that restoring its healthy function is important for sustained recovery. Dr. Judson Brewer's research on mindfulness and addiction has revealed that contemplative practices can specifically strengthen default mode network function while also reducing activity in brain circuits associated with craving and compulsive behavior. His work provides scientific validation for the use of meditation and mindfulness in addiction treatment. The digital age has also brought new understanding of how environmental design affects addictive behavior. Research on nudge theory has shown that small changes in how choices are presented can significantly influence behavior without restricting freedom. This research has led to new approaches to addiction prevention that focus on creating environments that make healthy choices easier and more attractive.
Cities are beginning to apply these insights by reducing the density of liquor stores in vulnerable neighborhoods, creating more attractive public spaces that don't revolve around substance use, and designing digital interfaces that promote healthy rather than compulsive engagement with technology. As we contemplate the digital age's contributions to addiction understanding, we see both unprecedented challenges and unprecedented opportunities. Technology has created new forms of addiction that affect millions of people worldwide, but it has also provided new tools for understanding the brain mechanisms of addiction and developing more effective treatments. The digital age has taught us that addiction is not about specific substances, but about brain circuits that can be activated by any sufficiently rewarding stimulus delivered in certain patterns. This insight has expanded our understanding of addiction while also providing new targets for intervention. Perhaps most importantly, the digital age has democratized access to information about addiction and recovery. People can now access high-quality educational resources, connect with recovery communities, and even receive evidence-based treatment through their smartphones. This increased access has the potential to help millions of people who previously had no access to effective addiction support. As you prepare for sleep in our digital age, consider powering down your devices and creating space for the kind of quiet reflection that has supported human well-being for millennia. Feel your breathing slow, your nervous system calm, your mind settle into the peaceful rhythms that technology can disrupt but never eliminate. The digital age reminds us that human nature remains constant even as our technologies change. We still need genuine social connection, meaningful purpose, and peaceful moments of rest and reflection. Technology can support these needs when used wisely. The Cave of Shadows. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're sitting by a crackling fire in a cave thousands of years ago. The flames dance against stone walls, casting shadows that seem to move with lives of their own. Outside, the wind whispers ancient secrets through pine branches heavy with snow. In this cave, our ancestors gathered not just for warmth, but for something deeper: connection, understanding, and sometimes escape. Tonight, dear listener, we're going to explore one of humanity's oldest companions, one that has walked alongside us since we first discovered fire, fermented fruit, and the magic of plants that could change how we felt inside. This is the story of addiction, not as a moral failing or a weakness, but as an ancient dance between the human heart and the world around us. Picture for you a young woman named Arya living 8,000 years ago in what we now call Turkey. She tends to barley fields that stretch golden under an endless sky, and her hands are stained purple from crushing grapes. She doesn't know that she's about to discover something that will chase humanity for millennia to come. She only knows that when she drinks the strange bubbling liquid that forms when fruit sits too long in clay jars, the heaviness in her chest, the weight of loss, of her brother who never returned from the hunt, seems to lift like morning mist. This is where our story begins, not with shame or judgment, but with understanding. Because addiction, you see, is really a story about love gone sideways, about the human heart's desperate search for peace, connection, and relief from the beautiful, terrible burden of being alive.
The Garden of First Tastes. Let's wander back even further, to the very beginning of time itself, when the earth was young and humans first learned to walk upright under stars that seemed close enough to pluck like fruit from trees. In this primordial garden, our earliest ancestors made a discovery that would echo through every generation that followed. Imagine the first human to taste fermented fruit that had fallen from a tree and begun to change, to transform into something that made the world feel softer around the edges. Picture their surprise as warmth spread through their chest, as laughter came easier, as the constant vigilance required for survival seemed to ease just for a moment. They didn't know they were experiencing the effects of ethanol on their brain's reward pathways. They only knew that this magical transformation made life feel different, more bearable, sometimes even joyful. But nature, in her infinite wisdom, had scattered many such gifts throughout the world. In the misty mountains of Asia, humans discovered that certain leaves, when chewed or brewed, could sharpen the mind and chase away fatigue. In the Americas, they found plants that could carry them on journeys beyond the physical world, connecting them to ancestors and spirits. In Africa, they learned that seeds and roots could ease pain, bring visions, or simply make the hard work of living feel lighter. Each discovery was like finding a key to a hidden door in the human experience. And behind each door lay both wonder and risk, healing and harm, connection and isolation. The ancient Sumerians, those clever people who gave us the first written words, had a saying carved into tablets of clay: the joy plant and the sorrow plant grow in the same garden. They understood, even 5,000 years ago, that the things which could lift us up could also lay us low. They brewed beer not just for celebration, but for daily sustenance, and they watched as some of their people found themselves unable to stop drinking from the clay vessels that promised relief from the harsh realities of early civilization. The Mesopotamian Scroll. Picture now a dusty library in ancient Babylon, where a scribe named Enkidu sits hunched over papyrus, his reed pen scratching careful cuneiform symbols by the light of an oil lamp. The year is 2000 BCE, and he's recording something that troubles him deeply: the story of his friend Shamash, a potter whose hands once shaped clay into vessels of breathtaking beauty, but who now shakes too violently to hold his tools. Shamash had discovered the opium poppy, that beautiful flower with petals like silk, and a seed pod that wept a milky tear when scored with a knife. When he first tasted that bitter resin dissolved in wine, it felt like the gods themselves had reached down to ease the ache in his back from years bent over his pottery wheel. But more than that, it quieted something deeper, the voice in his mind that whispered of inadequacy, of fears that his pottery would never be good enough, of a loneliness that seemed to echo through his very bones. Enkidu watches his friend and wonders, how does something that brings such relief become a prison? He doesn't know about neurotransmitters or the brain's reward pathways. He doesn't understand that the opium is flooding Shamash's brain with dopamine, creating new neural pathways that scream for more of the substance that once brought peace. All Enkidu knows is that his friend, who once laughed easily and worked with joy, now lives only for the moment when he can taste that bitter milk again. In his careful script, Enkidu writes what might be humanity's first recorded observation about addiction. The God who brings relief with one hand steals hope with the other. Yet still we reach out. For who among us does not ache for the relief only the gods can give? This ancient wisdom echoes through time because Enkidu understood something profound. Addiction isn't about weakness or moral failure. It's about the fundamental human experience of suffering and our eternal search for relief from that suffering. It's about love. Love for anything that can make the pain stop, even temporarily. Chapter 4. The Roman Bathhouse. The steam rises like prayers to forgotten gods in a Roman bathhouse, circa 100 CE. Marble columns support a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of Bacchus, the god of wine, dancing with nymphs through vineyards that stretch into eternity. Here, in this warm, honey-scented sanctuary, we meet Marcus Aurelius Cato,
Not the famous emperor, but a simple merchant who sells wine from clay amphora shipped from distant Gaul. Marcus has built his life around wine. He knows which hillsides produce grapes that sing with sunlight, which barrels age the nectar that makes senators weep with joy, which vintages can cure melancholy or inspire poets to write verses that will outlive empires. But Marcus has a secret that burns in his chest like molten bronze. He cannot remember the last day he didn't drink. It began instantly, as these things often do. After long days haggling in the market, he would sample his wares, telling himself it was simply quality control. When his young wife died in childbirth, wine became his companion in grief, the only friend who could sit with him in his pain without offering empty words of comfort. When business thrived, wine became his celebration. When it struggled, wine became his solace. Now, as he sits in the bathhouse, watching other merchants laugh and conduct business, he notices how his hands shake until he has his first drink of the day. He sees how his friend's eyes flicker with concern when he reaches for his fourth cup at dinner. He feels the shame burning hotter than the hypocast beneath the marble floors. But what Marcus doesn't understand, what no one in his time could understand, is that his brain has been quietly rewiring itself. Each night of drinking has strengthened neural pathways that associate wine with relief, safety, and normalcy. His brain's reward system, designed to help him survive and thrive, has learned to see wine not as a pleasure, but as a necessity, like food or water or air. The Roman physician Galen, wise as he was, could only observe the symptoms, the trembling hands, the red-rimmed eyes, the way some people seemed unable to stop once they started drinking. He wrote in his medical texts about the disease of excessive wine, but he understood it as an imbalance of bodily humors, not as the complex neurochemical process we now know it to be. But yet, in his simpler way, Galen grasped something profound. He noticed that people who drank excessively often shared certain traits. They were frequently those who had experienced great losses, who carried heavy responsibilities, or who possessed what he called sensitive souls, people who felt the world's joys and sorrows more deeply than others.
The medieval monastery. The bells of Cluny Abbey ring out across the French countryside, calling monks to vespers as the sun sets like molten gold behind rolling hills dotted with grapevines. It's 1147 CE, and Brother Thomas walks slowly through the herb garden, his woolen robes rustling against rosemary and lavender plants that release their perfume into the cooling air. Brother Thomas is the Abbey's infirmarian, keeper of healing knowledge that stretches back through centuries of careful observation and prayer. In his stone chamber, lined with wooden shelves, rest dozens of ceramic pots containing the monastery's pharmacopoeia: willow bark for pain, valerian root for sleeplessness, poppy milk for the agony of kidney stones, and hemp seeds for the melancholy that sometimes descends upon his brothers like a dark fog. Tonight, Brother Thomas is troubled. He's been watching Brother Francis, a young monk whose illuminated manuscripts are so beautiful they seem touched by divine inspiration. But Francis has been coming to the infirmary more and more frequently, complaining of headaches, of inability to sleep, of spiritual dryness that makes prayer feel like dust in his mouth. Each time he asks for the same remedy, a tincture made from poppy milk dissolved in wine. Brother Thomas knows the signs. He's seen them before, in other monks, in villagers, in pilgrims who stumble into the monastery seeking sanctuary. There's a moment when medicine becomes something else, when the cure becomes the disease, when the hand that reaches for relief can no longer stop reaching. The medieval mind understood addiction through the lens of theology and moral philosophy. They saw it as a battle between the spirit and the flesh, a test of will that could be overcome through prayer, fasting, and divine grace. Brother Thomas writes in his medical journal, "There are some souls who drink not for the taste of wine, but to quench a thirst that water cannot touch. This thirst comes not from the body, but from some wound in the very essence of being." Yet even in their limited understanding, the medieval monasteries were inadvertently creating some of the first addiction treatment programs in human history. The structure of monastic life, the regular prayers, the communal meals, the meaningful work, the support of brothers who understood struggle, provided exactly what modern science tells us addicted brains need most: routine, purpose, community, and hope. Brother Thomas doesn't know about dopamine receptors and the brain's prefrontal cortex, but he knows that Francis is suffering, and he knows that the suffering didn't begin with the poppy milk. It began with something deeper, some wound that drove Francis to seek ordination in the first place, some pain that even the beauty of God's creation couldn't quite heal. The age of exploration. The trade winds fill the sails of Portuguese caravel ships as they cut through azure waters toward distant shores, carrying with them more than just dreams of gold and spices. Captain João da Silva stands at the prow of his vessel, watching dolphins dance in the ship's wake, but his mind is on the small wooden box locked in his cabin, a box containing a substance that has become more precious to him than any treasure map. It's 1521, and European explorers are returning from the New World with wonders that will reshape human consciousness forever. Tobacco, coffee, chocolate, coca leaves, each bringing new ways to alter mood, energy, focus, and perception. They don't yet understand that they're conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment on human neurochemistry. Captain João first encountered tobacco during a trading expedition to the Caribbean islands. The Taíno people had shown him how they rolled the dried leaves and breathed in the smoke, explaining through gestures and broken Spanish that it calmed the mind and sharpened focus for long sea voyages. What João couldn't have known was that nicotine was hijacking his brain's reward system with ruthless efficiency, creating dependency faster than almost any other substance humans had yet discovered. Now, months later, João's hands shake when he tries to go more than a few hours without his tobacco. He tells himself it's just the motion of the ship, but deep down he knows better. The crew has begun to whisper about their captain's strange new habit, how he disappears below deck several times a day, returning with a peculiar smell clinging to his clothes and a calmness that seems almost supernatural. Back in Lisbon, physician Garcia de Horta is documenting these new substances in his medical texts, trying to understand their effects on the human body and spirit. He writes with growing concern, "These leaves from the Indies bring both healing and curse. They can calm the anxious mind and ease the pain of sailors far from home, yet they create a hunger that grows with feeding, a thirst that deepens with drinking." Garcia is witnessing something unprecedented in human history: the rapid globalization of psychoactive substances. For the first time, plants that evolved in specific ecosystems, used ceremonially by indigenous cultures with deep understanding of their power, are being transplanted into societies with no cultural framework for their use. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had developed elaborate rituals, social controls, and spiritual practices around these substances over thousands of years. Tobacco was sacred, used in ceremonies to connect with ancestors and spirits. Coca leaves were chewed by Inca runners to sustain them on long journeys through mountain passes, but always within a context of purpose and community oversight. Now these substances are being ripped from their cultural context and thrown into European societies already struggling with alcohol addiction, creating a perfect storm of human suffering that will echo through centuries. The Industrial Revolution's dark promise. The factory whistle shrieks through the gray dawn of Manchester, England, 1843. Smoke belches from tall brick chimneys, turning the sky the color of old pewter,
while workers stream through narrow streets like rivers of humanity, flowing toward the cotton mills that dominate the skyline. Among them walks Mary Whitworth, her small hands already stained with cotton fiber despite her 14 years, her lungs burning with each breath of the acrid air. Mary works 16 hours a day in the mill, her world reduced to the deafening clatter of machinery and the endless dance of threads that must never break. The air is thick with cotton dust that settles in her lungs like snow, and by evening her cough sounds like gravel being shaken in a tin cup. But Mary has discovered something that makes it all bearable. A bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup sold at the corner shop with promises to quiet the nerves and restore natural sleep. What Mary doesn't know, what no one knows, is that her soothing syrup contains morphine, the same substance that brings such peace to dying soldiers on battlefields. The Industrial Revolution has created something new in human history: mass-produced suffering alongside mass-produced relief. Factories churn out not just textiles and tools, but also patent medicines, tonics, and elixirs that promise to cure everything from melancholy to fatigue to the soul-crushing monotony of industrial life. Dr. James Morrison, a physician working in the industrial slums of Birmingham, begins to notice a pattern in his patients. The factory workers, the seamstresses, the dock workers, they all seem to develop what he calls the medicine habit. They come to him first for legitimate ailments: the baker's wife with terrible headaches from the heat of the ovens, the blacksmith with back pain that keeps him awake at night, the mill girl with the cough that won't quit. But something strange happens with the medicines he prescribes. Patients return again and again, claiming their original symptoms have worsened, needing stronger and more frequent doses. Dr. Morrison begins to suspect that the cure is becoming the disease, but he lacks the scientific framework to understand why. What Dr. Morrison is witnessing is the birth of modern addiction in an industrial age. The combination of mass-produced suffering and mass-produced psychoactive substances are creating unprecedented levels of dependency. For the first time in human history, large populations are regularly exposed to potent, refined chemicals without the cultural safeguards that had protected previous generations. In his medical journal, Dr. Morrison writes with growing alarm, "I fear we have unleashed something we do not understand. These medicines that bring such swift relief seem to create a hunger that feeds on itself. The very cure we offer becomes a new form of suffering, yet our patients beg for it as drowning men beg for air." Mary Whitworth doesn't think about any of this as she counts out the coins for her daily bottle. She only knows that without it, the world feels too sharp, too loud, too overwhelming. The medicine has become her armor against a reality that was never designed for human souls to endure alone. Chapter 8: The Opium Dreams of Victorian London. Gas lamps flicker like dying stars through the fog that shrouds London's East End, casting pale yellow circles of light on cobblestones slick with rain and secrets. The year is 1868, and Dr. Eleanor Blackwood makes her way through narrow alleys where shadows seem to whisper in languages older than memory. She's not here as a tourist or a social reformer, but as a physician trying to understand a mystery that's consuming her city from within. Dr. Blackwood stops before a door marked only by a small red lantern, pushes inside, and descends into what the newspapers call opium dens, but what she recognizes as something far more complex: sanctuaries of escape for souls crushed by the weight of progression. The air is thick with sweet smoke that curls like incense around oil lamps, and on wooden benches lie figures that might be corpses if not for the gentle rise and fall of their breathing. Among them is Thomas Quincy, not the famous writer, but a dock worker whose hands are permanently curved from years of hauling cargo from ships that carry the wealth of empire. Thomas first tasted opium as medicine for a shoulder injury that screamed with pain each time he lifted a crate. But the medicine did more than ease his physical hurt. It silenced the voice in his head that told him he was worthless, that his life was meaningless, that he was nothing more than a beast of burden in service to others' dreams. In the opium dream, Thomas becomes the man he was meant to be. He walks through gardens where flowers sing lullabies in colors he has no names for.
He speaks with his father, dead this 20 years, who tells him he's proud of the man his son has become. He feels worthy of love, worthy of peace, worthy of beauty. For 3 hours, Thomas inhabits a world where suffering is not the natural state of existence.
Dr. Blackwood watches Thomas and sees not moral weakness, but profound human pain seeking relief through the only means available. She's been studying the new medical texts coming from Germany, reading about something called morphinism, the recognition that the very medicines that heal can also enslave. But even these advanced medical minds think of addiction as a disease of will, a failure of character that can be cured through moral instruction and strong resolve. What Dr. Blackwood intuits, though she lacks the scientific language to express it, is that addiction is really about adaptation. The human brain, that miraculous organ that can learn languages and compose symphonies and navigate by starlight, is simply doing what it does best, learning, adapting, prioritizing survival. When it discovers a substance that reliably reduces suffering and increases pleasure, it adjusts its entire operating system around obtaining that substance. In her private journals, Dr. Blackwood writes, "I have begun to suspect that what we call addiction is not a moral failing, but a kind of misdirected love. These souls do not seek destruction, they seek salvation. Their bodies have simply learned to find salvation in the wrong places." She's more right than she knows. The Victorian era is creating unprecedented levels of trauma through industrialization, urbanization, and social upheaval. People are being severed from the natural world, from extended families, from meaningful work, from connection to the sacred. Into this void flows substances that promise what civilization has taken away: peace, connection, transcendence, relief from the terrible isolation of modern life. The American frontier and patent medicine dreams. The prairie wind carries the scent of sage and distant rain as Sarah Henderson guides her covered wagon across the endless expanse of Kansas, 1875. Her husband William walks alongside the oxen, his face weathered like old leather from months under the relentless sun. Behind them, their 3 children sleep fitfully in the wagon bed, coughing with the sickness that has plagued them since they left Independence. In Sarah's treasure box, wrapped carefully in cotton cloth, sits a bottle of Dr. Hartwell's celebrated nerve and brain tonic. The label promises relief from nervous exhaustion, melancholy, hysteria, and all disorders of the feminine constitution. What the label doesn't mention is that the tonic contains a hefty dose of cocaine dissolved in alcohol, a combination that makes Sarah feel like she could walk across the entire continent if necessary. Sarah discovered the tonic during their stop in Kansas City, purchased from a traveling salesman who spoke with the fervor of a preacher about its miraculous properties. That first dose felt like drinking liquid sunlight. The exhaustion that had settled into her bones like sediment in a riverbed simply vanished. The anxiety about money, about the children's health, about whether they would survive the journey to Oregon, all of it lifted like fog burning off a lake at sunrise. But now, 3 weeks later, Sarah finds herself counting the ounces remaining in the bottle with the desperation of someone calculating water in a desert. When the tonic runs low, a strange illness descends upon her. Her hands shake, her head pounds, and a darkness settles over her thoughts that feels deeper than any natural sadness. The American frontier is creating perfect conditions for addiction on a massive scale. Families are isolated from support systems, facing constant danger and uncertainty. Traditional communities have been shattered by westward migration. People are dealing with traumas, the loss of children to disease, the violence of frontier life, the brutal loneliness of endless prairies, without any of the cultural practices that might help them process such experiences.
Into this psychological wilderness comes an entire industry of patent medicines, each promising to cure the ailments of the human soul. Cocaine for energy, morphine for pain, alcohol for everything in between. The bottles carry names like Mother's Helper, Cowboy's Relief, and Pioneer's Friend, marketing themselves as companions for the lonely journey of building a new life in an unforgiving land. Dr. Moses Shepard, a physician traveling the Oregon Trail to establish a practice in Portland, keeps a careful record of what he observes. His journal entry from July 15, 1875 reads, "I have come to believe that the medicines we carry are as necessary to the pioneer spirit as our rifles and our plows. Yet I notice that some souls seem to need these medicines not occasionally, but constantly, as if they have forgotten how to feel normal without them. It is as if their bodies have learned a new definition of what feels right." Dr. Shepard is witnessing the birth of mass-market addiction in America, though he doesn't yet have the scientific framework to understand what he's seeing. The patent medicine industry is conducting an unprecedented experiment in psychoactive chemistry on an unsuspecting population, creating dependencies that will be passed down through generations. Chapter 10. The Birth of Understanding. In a small laboratory in Würzburg, Germany, 1889, Dr. Heinrich Dresser carefully measures crystalline powder onto a brass scale. Outside his window, snow falls silently on cobblestone streets where horse-drawn carriages clatter past gaslit shops. Dr. Dresser believes he's about to solve one of medicine's greatest challenges: how to provide the pain-relieving benefits of morphine without the terrible dependency that so often follows. The powder he's measuring is diacetylmorphine, a chemical modification of morphine that his colleague Felix Hoffmann has just synthesized. They're calling it heroin, from the German word heroisches, meaning heroic, because early tests suggest it's more effective than morphine for treating pain and cough, yet somehow less addictive. They are, of course, catastrophically wrong. But their mistake teaches us something crucial about the nature of addiction. It's not about moral weakness or lack of willpower. It's about brain chemistry, about the way certain substances can hijack the neural pathways that evolved to keep us alive and motivated. Dr. Dresser doesn't know that heroin actually crosses into the brain more quickly than morphine, creating an even more intense euphoria and, consequently, even stronger addiction potential. He doesn't understand that addiction isn't really about the substance itself, but about the relationship between a vulnerable brain and a substance that provides relief from suffering.
In his research papers, Dr. Gold documents what he calls the cocaine paradox. Users report that cocaine makes them feel powerful, confident, and in control, yet their behavior becomes increasingly compulsive and out of control. They describe the drug as enhancing their performance, yet their actual performance in work and relationships deteriorates rapidly. Michael experiences this paradox firsthand. Cocaine initially made him feel like a master of the universe, charming, intelligent, capable of anything. Business deals that once seemed impossible became easy. Conversations that once made him anxious became effortless. He felt like he had finally become the person he was meant to be. But gradually, imperceptibly, the cocaine began to change him. The confidence became arrogance. The enhanced focus became obsessive tunnel vision. The energy became manic restlessness. Most troubling of all, the periods between cocaine use became gray valleys of depression and fatigue that only more cocaine could lift. What Michael doesn't understand is that cocaine is creating profound changes in his brain's reward system. Each time he uses cocaine, it blocks the reuptake of dopamine in his neural synapses, creating an artificial flood of the neurotransmitter that signals pleasure and motivation. Over time, his brain adapts by reducing its natural dopamine production and decreasing the sensitivity of dopamine receptors.
This neuroadaptation means that Michael's brain now requires cocaine just to feel normal, while natural pleasures, food, sex, music, friendship, lose their ability to provide satisfaction. He's not seeking a high anymore. He's seeking relief from the profound emptiness that cocaine itself has created. The 1980s also marked the beginning of America's war on drugs, a policy approach that treats addiction as a criminal justice problem rather than a public health issue. While Michael, a white professional, is able to afford treatment when his cocaine use finally destroys his business, millions of Americans, particularly in communities of color, find themselves incarcerated rather than treated for their substance use disorders. Dr. Carl Hart, one of the first African-American professors of psychology at Columbia University, begins to study how social factors influence addiction outcomes. His research reveals that people with stable housing, meaningful work, and strong social connections are far less likely to develop addictive behaviors even when exposed to the same substances as those who become dependent. In his groundbreaking work, Dr. Hart writes, "The vast majority of people who use drugs, even drugs like cocaine and heroin, do not become addicted. Addiction occurs primarily when drugs become the most attractive option in a person's environment, when they provide relief, pleasure, or meaning that cannot be found elsewhere in that person's life." Chapter 17, The OxyContin Chronicles. The morning mist clings to the hollows of eastern Kentucky like the ghosts of ancient forests, 1999. In the small town of Prestonsburg, Dr. Sarah McKenzie opens her family practice clinic and prepares for another day of treating the coal miners, factory workers, and farmers who form the backbone of Appalachian life. On her desk sits a pamphlet from Purdue Pharma promising pain relief that lasts 12 hours without addiction concerns. Dr. McKenzie has been watching her patients suffer for years. Men whose backs are bent from decades in the mines, women whose hands are twisted from arthritis and repetitive factory work, elderly folks whose bodies carry the accumulated injuries of hard lives lived close to the land. She's always been conservative with pain medication, having seen too many patients develop dependencies on morphine and codeine. But this new medication, OxyContin, seems different. The pharmaceutical representatives assure her that the time-release formula makes addiction virtually impossible. They cite studies showing that less than 1% of patients become addicted to prescription opioids. They speak of a new understanding of pain as the fifth vital sign that must be treated aggressively to maintain quality of life. Among Dr. McKenzie's first patients to receive OxyContin is Tommy Lawson, a 34-year-old coal miner whose vertebrae were crushed in a mine collapse. For the first time in 3 years, Tommy can sleep through the night without waking in agony. He can pick up his daughter and swing her around the yard. He can work in his garden, fixing the small things around his house that have been neglected during years of constant pain. For 6 months, OxyContin seems like a miracle. Tommy takes his prescribed dose twice a day and experiences something he had almost forgotten existed, a life where pain doesn't dominate every moment. But gradually, imperceptibly, the OxyContin began to change him. The confidence became arrogance. The enhanced focus became obsessive tunnel vision. The energy became manic restlessness. Most troubling of all, the periods between OxyContin use became gray valleys of depression and fatigue that only more OxyContin could lift. What Tommy doesn't understand is that OxyContin is creating profound changes in his brain's reward system. Each time he uses OxyContin, it blocks the reuptake of dopamine in his neural synapses, creating an artificial flood of the neurotransmitter that signals pleasure and motivation. Over time, his brain adapts by reducing its natural dopamine production and decreasing the sensitivity of dopamine receptors. This neuroadaptation means that Michael's brain now requires OxyContin just to feel normal, while natural pleasures, food, sex, music, friendship, lose their ability to provide satisfaction. He's not seeking a high anymore. He's seeking relief from the profound emptiness that OxyContin itself has created.
The counterculture and sacred plants. The incense smoke drifts like prayers through the cramped apartment in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, 1967. Sitar music mingles with the sound of traffic and foghorns from the bay, while rainbow light filters through prisms hung in the windows. Here, in this epicenter of the counterculture movement, A young man named David Goldstein sits cross-legged on a Persian rug, contemplating a small square of paper that contains 250 micrograms of lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. David is not seeking escape from reality, but a deeper entrance into it. He's read the writings of Aldous Huxley, who described mescaline as opening the doors of perception. He studied the research of Dr. Timothy Leary at Harvard, who claimed that psychedelic substances could expand consciousness and heal psychological wounds. David sees LSD not as a drug, but as a sacrament, a key to unlock the cosmic consciousness that he believes lies dormant within every human soul. What David experiences over the next 12 hours seems to confirm his highest hopes. Colors become symphonies, music becomes visible geometry, and the boundaries between himself and the universe dissolve like sugar and rain. He feels connected to everything. The potted plant in the corner, which seems to pulse with its own inner light, the strangers in the next apartment, whose emotions he can somehow feel as if they were his own, the vast web of consciousness that he now perceives underlying all existence. But as weeks turn to months, David finds himself reaching for LSD not just for spiritual exploration, but for relief from the growing discomfort of ordinary consciousness. The everyday world begins to feel gray and flat compared to the technicolor intensity of his trips. His job at the bookstore becomes unbearable, not because it's difficult, but because it feels meaningless in light of the cosmic truths he's glimpsed. Dr. Sidney Cohn, a psychiatrist studying psychedelic substances at UCLA, is documenting both the promise and the peril of these powerful molecules. His research suggests that psychedelics can indeed produce profound therapeutic benefits for certain conditions, depression, PTSD, addiction to other substances, but only when used in controlled, supportive settings with proper preparation and integration. In his research notes, Dr. Cohen writes, "These substances appear to temporarily dissolve the ego's defensive structures, allowing access to unconscious material and traumatic memories in ways that can facilitate healing. However, when used without proper context or support, they can also destabilize psychological functioning and create a form of spiritual bypassing, an attempt to avoid dealing with practical life challenges by retreating into altered states of consciousness." David is experiencing exactly this phenomenon. LSD has shown him glimpses of transcendence, but he hasn't learned how to integrate those insights into the practical challenges of daily life. Instead of using psychedelics as occasional tools for growth and healing, he's using them as regular escape from a reality that now seems unbearably mundane. The 1960s counterculture movement is conducting another massive, uncontrolled experiment in human consciousness. Unlike previous generations who stumbled into addiction through medical treatment or social drinking, young people like David are deliberately seeking altered states of consciousness as a form of spiritual practice. They're rediscovering the sacred use of psychoactive plants that indigenous cultures have honored for thousands of years, but they're doing so without the cultural frameworks, preparation rituals, and community support that made such use sustainable. Dr. Stanislav Grof, a Czech psychiatrist researching psychedelic therapy, makes a crucial observation. The same substance can be either medicine or poison, sacrament or curse, depending entirely on the intentions, setting, and psychological preparation of the user. The molecule itself is neutral. It's the relationship between the person and the substance that determines the outcome. Chapter 16. The Cocaine Cowboys and the War on Drugs. The neon lights of Miami Beach flicker like electric fireflies against the black velvet of Biscayne Bay, 1985. In a penthouse overlooking the water, Michael Ramirez counts stacks of $100 bills while white powder sits in neat lines on a mirror that reflects the city's glittering skyline. The radio plays Miami Vice's theme song, and everything feels like a movie: fast, bright, dangerous, unreal. Michael is living the cocaine dream of the 1980s, when the drug was marketed as the perfect accessory for the decade of excess.
Cocaine was sold as non-addictive, as a sophisticated party drug for successful people, as the fuel that powered Wall Street, Hollywood, and the art world. Unlike heroin or alcohol, cocaine seemed to enhance rather than impair performance. Users were productive, confident, articulate, ambitious, everything that Reagan-era America valued. But Dr. Mark Gold, working at Fair Oaks Hospital in New Jersey, is beginning to see the other side of the cocaine dream. His emergency room is filling up with patients experiencing heart attacks, seizures, and psychotic episodes from cocaine use. More troubling still, he's seeing people who seem to be unable to stop using cocaine, despite devastating consequences: lost jobs, destroyed relationships, financial ruin. Dr. Gold is among the first researchers to understand that cocaine addiction operates differently from alcohol or opiate addiction. Cocaine doesn't create the same physical withdrawal symptoms, but it creates something potentially more insidious, an intense psychological craving that can persist for months or years after last use. He's seeing patients in deep darkness, not the Guyanan rainforest, but the inner workings of their struggle with cocaine.
The scientific awakening. In a sterile laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, 1954, Dr. James Olds adjusts the tiny electrodes he's just implanted into a rat's brain. Outside his window, Baltimore spreads like a patchwork quilt of brick row houses and factory smokestacks. But Dr. Olds' attention is focused entirely on the small creature before him. He's about to make a discovery that will revolutionize our understanding of addiction, though he doesn't know it yet. The rat, which Dr. Olds has named Einstein because he seems cleverer than the others, has learned to press a small lever that delivers electrical stimulation to a specific region of his brain. But something extraordinary is happening. Einstein is pressing the lever obsessively, ignoring food, water, even sexual partners, sometimes up to 2,000 times per hour, until he collapses from exhaustion. Dr. Olds stares at Einstein in fascination and growing concern. He's accidentally discovered what will later be called the brain's reward pathway, a neural circuit that evolved to motivate behaviors essential for survival, like eating, mating, and caring for offspring. But when stimulated directly, this pathway creates a desire so intense that it overrides all other motivations. "My God," Dr. Olds whispers to his research partner, Dr. Peter Milner, "we've found the brain's pleasure center, and it's more powerful than we ever imagined." What Dr. Olds doesn't yet realize is that he's looking at the neurological foundation of all addiction. Every addictive substance, alcohol, opiates, cocaine, nicotine, hijacks the same reward pathway, flooding it with dopamine and teaching the brain to prioritize the substance above everything else, including survival itself. Meanwhile, across the country in California, a different kind of scientific revolution is beginning. Dr. Bill Wilson, though not a physician but a stockbroker whose life was destroyed by alcoholism, is developing insights that will prove as important as any laboratory discovery. Together with Dr. Bob Smith, a surgeon whose hands shook too badly to operate until he had his morning drink, Wilson is founding Alcoholics Anonymous, based on a radical idea. Addiction is a disease that can't be cured through willpower alone, but requires spiritual awakening and community support. The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, published in 1939 but gaining widespread recognition in the 1950s, contains wisdom that anticipates many later scientific discoveries. The idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. Wilson and Smith are describing what neuroscientists will later identify as the addicted brain's inability to accurately assess its own condition. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, becomes compromised by chronic substance use, leading to what researchers call impaired insight,
the persistent belief that this time will be different, that control is just one drink away. The suburban prescription. The manicured lawns of Westchester County stretch like green velvet under the summer sun of 1962. Behind the picture windows of split-level homes, automatic dishwashers hum their mechanical lullabies, while families gather around television sets to watch Leave It to Beaver and Andy Griffith Show. This is the America that Madison Avenue sells. Prosperous, peaceful, perfect. But within one of these perfect homes, Patricia Morrison sits at her kitchen table staring at a small amber bottle of pills that her doctor prescribed for nervous tension. The pills are called Milltown, and they're part of a new class of medications called minor tranquilizers, designed to help housewives cope with what magazines are calling the suburban blues. Patricia's life, viewed from outside, is everything a woman of her generation was supposed to want. Her husband, Charles, works in Manhattan, earning enough money to afford their mortgage, 2 cars, and a yearly vacation to Cape Cod. Their 3 children are healthy and well-behaved. Their house is featured in Better Homes and Gardens. Patricia herself is beautiful, intelligent, accomplished at the social graces that matter in her circle. So why does she feel like she's drowning? The Milltown helps. When Patricia takes her morning pill, the tight knot in her chest loosens. The voice in her head that catalogs her failures, the dinner party where the roast was overcooked, the PTA meeting where she forgot to volunteer for the bake sale, the way her youngest son looks at her sometimes with disappointment she can't understand, finally goes quiet. But Patricia has begun to notice something troubling. One pill no longer lasts the entire day. She started taking a second pill after lunch, then a third before dinner. When she tries to skip a day, she feels physically ill, sweaty, shaky, consumed by anxiety so intense it feels like impending doom. What Patricia doesn't know is that she's experiencing the birth of prescription drug addiction in suburban America. The 1950s and 1960s see an explosion in the development and marketing of psychiatric medications, often with little understanding of their addiction potential. Pharmaceutical companies are promising to solve the emotional problems of modern life through chemistry, and doctors are prescribing mood-altering substances with the casual confidence once reserved for aspirin. Dr. James Gordon is a psychiatrist working at McLean Hospital outside Boston. He's beginning to notice a pattern among his patients. Housewives like Patricia are arriving at his clinic not with traditional mental illnesses, but with dependencies on medications that were supposed to help them. He writes in his case notes, "We have created a new category of patient, the accidental addict. These are individuals who never sought intoxication, who followed medical advice precisely, yet find themselves unable to function without substances that were supposed to restore normal function." The suburban prescription epidemic is teaching society something crucial about addiction. It's not about seeking a high or escaping reality. Often it's about trying to feel normal in circumstances that make normal feelings impossible to sustain. Patricia's addiction isn't about moral weakness. It's about a brain trying to cope with the isolation, purposelessness, and emotional suppression that characterized women's lives in 1950s America.
Dr. Anna Rose Childress, researching addiction at the University of Pennsylvania, is using new brain imaging technology to understand what happens in the addicted brain. Her fMRI scans revealed that when addicted individuals are shown images related to their drug of choice, specific brain regions light up with activity, the same regions that activate when hungry people see food or when parents see their children. Addiction, Dr. Childress explains in her landmark paper, is not about seeking pleasure or avoiding reality. It's about a hijacked learning system. The brain has learned to categorize the addictive substance as essential for survival, triggering the same neural responses that once motivated our ancestors to seek food, shelter, and mates. Tommy doesn't know about neural plasticity or dopamine receptor downregulation. He only knows that the pills that once made him feel normal now barely keep withdrawal symptoms at bay. When his prescription runs out early, as it inevitably does when the time-release mechanism fails, he experiences symptoms that feel like the worst flu of his life: sweating, nausea, muscle aches, and an anxiety so intense it feels like his skin is crawling with invisible insects. Desperate for relief, Tommy turns to the street market that has sprung up around prescription opioids. A single OxyContin pill that costs $6 at the pharmacy sells for $80 on the street. When that becomes financially impossible, Tommy makes a decision that once would have been unthinkable. He tries heroin, which provides the same relief at a fraction of the cost. Dr. Mackenzie watches this transformation with horror and growing understanding. Her most responsible patients, people who followed their prescriptions exactly, who never sought to get high, who simply wanted to return to normal life, are becoming addicted at rates that bear no resemblance to the studies she was shown. In her medical journal, she writes, "I believed I was healing pain, but I fear I have been creating it. The medicine that promised to restore my patients' lives has become a thief that steals everything they hold dear. Yet I see no malice in my patients, no moral failing, only human beings whose bodies have learned to depend on a substance they never chose to become dependent upon." Chapter 18: The Neuroscience Revolution. In a state-of-the-art laboratory at Harvard Medical School, 2003, Dr. Elena Rodriguez peers into a computer monitor displaying brain scans that look like abstract art, swirls of red, yellow, and blue, that represent blood flow and neural activity in living human brains. But these beautiful images tell a story of profound tragedy and unexpected hope. Dr. Rodriguez is part of a new generation of addiction researchers who can, for the first time in human history, watch addiction happen in real time inside the living brain. Using positron emission tomography, PET scans, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, she can see how addictive substances change brain structure and function, sometimes permanently. On her monitor, she compares two brain scans, one from a healthy volunteer, another from someone with cocaine addiction. The differences are startling. In the addicted brain, regions responsible for impulse control show dramatically reduced activity, while areas associated with craving and habit formation are hyperactive, as if the brain has been hijacked by a single-minded pursuit of the substance, sacrificing its higher functions to serve this overwhelming need. "Look at this," Dr. Rodriguez says to her research assistant, pointing to the prefrontal cortex on the screen. In the healthy brain, this region lights up when making decisions, weighing consequences, controlling impulses. In the addicted brain, it's gone dark. The person isn't choosing to use drugs, their brain has lost the capacity to choose anything else. This research is revolutionizing our understanding of addiction, moving it definitively from the realm of moral failing into the realm of medical science. Dr. Nora Volkow, director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, synthesizes decades of research into a new definition. Addiction is a chronic, relapsing brain disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. But the neuroscience reveals something even more profound and hopeful: the brain's remarkable capacity for healing. Dr. Rodriguez's longitudinal studies showed that with sustained abstinence and proper treatment, many of the brain changes associated with addiction can reverse. New neural pathways can form, damaged regions can regain function, and the capacity for choice can be restored. In the secure ward of McLean Hospital, Dr. Rodriguez meets with patients whose stories illustrate the complex interplay between biology, psychology, and environment that creates addiction. There's Maria, a nurse who became addicted to fentanyl after stealing it from her hospital's pharmacy to treat chronic pain from a car accident. There's James, a veteran whose PTSD led him to self-medicate with alcohol and benzodiazepines. There's Lisa, a high school honor student who tried heroin at a party and found that it silenced the perfectionist voice in her head that had been driving her toward an eating disorder. Each patient's brain scans tell a similar story. Regions involved in decision-making and impulse control show reduced activity, while areas involved in stress response and craving show hyperactivity. But each patient's personal story is unique, shaped by genetics, trauma, social support,
and the particular substance that hijacked their reward system. Dr. Rodriguez is learning that addiction is not one disease, but many diseases, not one story, but millions of stories, each shaped by the unique intersection of a particular brain with a particular substance in a particular environment at a particular moment in time. The brain, she explains to medical students, is not a computer that can be programmed and reprogrammed at will. It's more like a garden, dynamic, adaptive, constantly growing and changing in response to its environment. Addictive substances are like invasive species that can take over the garden's ecosystem, but with proper care, the garden's natural balance can be restored.
The digital age and behavioral addictions. The blue light from laptop screens casts an ethereal glow in the Google headquarters cafeteria, 2007. Software engineers fuel late-night coding sessions with energy drinks and the dopamine hits that come from solving complex problems. Among them sits Dr. Adam Gazzaley, a neuroscientist who's beginning to realize that the same brain mechanisms that drive substance addiction might also apply to our relationships with technology. Dr. Gazzaley has been studying how digital devices affect attention and impulse control, and his findings are troubling. The constant stream of notifications, likes, messages, and updates triggers the release of dopamine in exactly the same brain regions that respond to cocaine, alcohol, and gambling. The smartphone, he's beginning to realize, is not just a communication device, it's a portable dopamine delivery system. In Silicon Valley, former tech executive Tristan Harris is having his own awakening about the addictive design of digital platforms. He's worked inside companies that employ teams of neuroscientists and behavioral economists to make their products as engaging as possible. He knows about the variable ratio reinforcement schedules that make social media notifications so compelling, the fear of missing out that keeps users constantly checking their feeds, the infinite scroll that ensures there's never a natural stopping point. We've built a global nervous system, Harris explains to anyone who will listen, and we've designed it to be addictive. Every notification is a little hit of dopamine. Every like is a small social reward. Every swipe is a tiny gamble that might pay off with something interesting or important.